Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Earl had been driving trucks for 23 years, and in all that time, he'd never had a serious problem at a weigh station. Sure, there'd been the occasional overweight ticket, a logbook discrepancy here and there, but nothing that couldn't be sorted out with a few phone calls and some paperwork. That's why what happened at the Cascade Way Station on Interstate 5, just north of the California-Oregon border, still haunts him to this day. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, and Earl was hauling a load of lumber from Portland down to Sacramento. The weather had been decent for the time of year, overcast but dry, with temperatures hovering around 45 degrees. He'd made this run dozens of times before, knew every mile of I-5 like the back of his weathered hands, and was making good time despite the holiday traffic that was starting to build up. The electronic sign about 5 miles before the weigh station flashed its familiar message. All commercial vehicles must enter. Earl sighed and moved into the right lane, preparing for what he assumed would be a routine inspection. The Cascade Station was known for being thorough but fair, and Earl's paperwork was always in perfect order. His 2018 Freightliner Cascadia was well maintained. His electronic logging device showed he was within his hours of service, and his load was properly secured and under the weight limit. As he pulled into the queue behind a refrigerated trailer, Earl noticed something odd. The line was longer than usual, maybe 15 trucks ahead of him, but that wasn't the strange part. What caught his attention was the complete lack of movement. Normally, even at busy stations, you'd see trucks rolling across the scales every few minutes, either getting waved through or directed to the inspection area. But this line was completely static. Earl sat there for 20 minutes, engine idling, watching the truck ahead of him. The driver, visible through his side mirror, seemed agitated, constantly checking his watch and making phone calls. Behind Earl, more trucks were lining up, creating a growing queue of increasingly frustrated drivers. The CB radio crackled with complaints and questions, but nobody seemed to have any information about what was causing the delay. After 30 minutes of no movement, Earl decided to walk up to the scale house to see what was happening. He locked his truck and made his way past the line of waiting vehicles, noting the mix of anxiety and anger on the other drivers' faces. Some were standing beside their trucks, smoking cigarettes and talking in small groups. Others remained in their cabs, presumably trying to reach their dispatchers to explain the delay. The scale house was a modest concrete building with large windows overlooking the scales. As Earl approached, he could see several inspectors inside, but they weren't processing trucks. Instead, they appeared to be in some kind of meeting, huddled around a desk and examining documents. One inspector, a tall man with graying hair and a severe expression, looked up and saw Earl approaching. He immediately came to the door. "Driver, you need to return to your vehicle," the inspector said. His name tag read H. Grayson, but Earl would later learn this was Inspector Horace Grayson, a man who'd been with the Department of Transportation for 32 years and had developed a reputation for finding violations where none existed. "Inspector, we've been sitting here for over half an hour with no movement," Earl said, trying to keep his voice respectful despite his frustration. "Can you tell us what's going on? Some of us have delivery deadlines." Horace's eyes narrowed slightly, and he pulled out a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "What's your truck number, driver?" "I'm in the blue Freightliner, about 12 trucks back," Earl replied. "Unit 447. Horace wrote something in his notebook, then looked back at Earl with an expression that made Earl's stomach tighten. "Return to your vehicle, driver. We'll be conducting thorough inspections today. Every truck, every driver, every piece of cargo. This is a special enforcement operation." "Special enforcement for what?" Earl asked. I haven't heard about any alerts or safety campaigns. Return to your vehicle, Horace repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. We'll get to you when we get to you. Any driver who attempts to leave the queue without inspection will have their CDL suspended immediately. Earl walked back to his truck, unease growing with each step. In all his years of driving, he'd never encountered a special enforcement operation that wasn't announced in advance. The DOT always gave drivers warning about targeted inspections or safety campaigns. This felt different, wrong somehow. Back in his cab, Earl turned up his CB radio, listening to the chatter from other drivers. The consensus was confusion and growing anger. Some drivers had been waiting for over 2 hours now, and still, not a single truck had moved through the scales. A few drivers were talking about backing out and taking their chances with a suspended license, but most were afraid of the consequences. "This is Big Blue in truck 447, Earl said into his CB microphone. "Anyone know what's really going on here? This ain't no normal inspection." "Big Blue, this is Redline," came a response from a driver several trucks ahead. "I walked up there about an hour ago. They got my information and told me the same thing they told you. Special enforcement operation. But I've been sitting here since 1 o'clock, and that's going on 3 hours now." 3 hours? Earl couldn't believe it. "You see any trucks actually get through?" "Negative, Big Blue. Not a single one. And here's the weird part. I can see them bringing drivers into the scale house one at a time, but I ain't seen any of them come back out to their trucks." Earl felt a chill run down his spine. He grabbed his binoculars from the overhead compartment and focused on the scale house. Through the large windows, he could see several figures moving around inside, but the glare from the overhead lights made it impossible to make out details. What he could see was that there seemed to be more people inside than just the usual 2 or 3 inspectors. His phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was his dispatcher, wanting to know why his GPS showed he'd been stationary for so long. "I'm stuck at the Cascade Way Station," Earl explained. "They're running some kind of special inspection, and nobody's moving through." "Special inspection? I haven't heard anything about that," his dispatcher said. "Let me make some calls. This doesn't sound right." While Earl waited for his dispatcher to call back, he noticed movement at the scale house. An inspector was walking down the line of trucks with a clipboard, stopping at each vehicle and apparently taking down information. When the inspector reached Earl's truck, he knocked on the door. Earl rolled down his window. It was a different inspector this time, a younger man with nervous eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he held his clipboard. "I need your license, registration, and bills of lading," the inspector said, not quite meeting Earl's eyes. "Is everything all right?" Earl asked as he handed over his documents. "You seem—" "Everything's fine," the inspector cut him off, but his voice cracked slightly on the word fine. He studied Earl's paperwork, made several notes on his clipboard, then looked up at Earl with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "Mr. Earl Henderson?" "That's right." "You're hauling lumber from Portland to Sacramento?" "Yes, sir. Just like it says on the bills." The inspector made more notes, then leaned closer to Earl's window. For a moment, Earl thought he was going to say something, maybe explain what was really happening. But then the younger man seemed to catch himself. He straightened up and handed Earl's documents back. "You'll be called for inspection soon. Please remain in your vehicle." As the inspector walked away, Earl noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the back of the man's uniform shirt, there was a dark stain that looked suspiciously like blood. Not a lot, just a few drops, but definitely blood. Fresh blood. Earl's phone rang again. His dispatcher's voice was tight with concern. "Earl, I called the DOT office for that region. They say the Cascade Station is closed for maintenance today. Has been since this morning. There shouldn't be anyone there at all." Earl's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Well, I'm looking at about 20 trucks and at least 6 inspectors who would disagree with that." Earl, get out of there, now! I can't. They're threatening to pull licenses if anyone leaves without inspection. Earl, listen to me. I also called California Highway Patrol. They're sending units to check it out, but they're at least 40 minutes away. Something's not right there. Before Earl could respond, he saw Horace approaching his truck. The inspector's face was set in a grim expression, and he was accompanied by two other men in DOT uniforms, though Earl noticed their uniforms didn't quite fit properly, as if they'd been taken from someone else. Mr. Henderson, Horace called out. We need you to come with us for your inspection now. Earl's instincts, honed by over 2 decades on the road, were screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. But he was trapped. His truck was hemmed in by vehicles front and back. He couldn't leave without his truck, and he couldn't move his truck without cooperation from the other drivers. I'll be right there, Earl called back, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone and quickly sent a text to his wife with his location, then another to his dispatcher saying he was being taken in for inspection. He slipped his phone into his boot, grabbed his paperwork, and climbed down from his cab. As he walked toward the scale house with Horace and the 2 other men, Earl noticed that the parking area behind the building, which should have been empty if the station was closed for maintenance, contained several unmarked vans and what looked like personal vehicles. None of them had government plates. Inspector Grayson, Earl said, trying to keep his voice steady. My dispatcher just called and said this station is supposed to be closed today. Horace didn't break stride. Your dispatcher was misinformed. They reached the door to the scale house, and one of the other men held it open. The moment Earl stepped inside, he understood why none of the other drivers had returned to their trucks. They were all here, sitting on the floor against the far wall, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. There were at least 8 drivers, all looking terrified and confused. What the hell is this? Earl demanded, starting to back toward the door, but the 2 men blocked his exit. Horace pulled out what looked like an official DOT badge, but Earl could now see was a crude fake. Mr. Henderson, we have reason to believe you're transporting contraband. You're being detained pending a thorough investigation. Contraband? I'm hauling lumber. You can check it yourself. We intend to, Horace said. But first, we need to secure all drivers for our safety and yours. He nodded to the 2 men, who moved toward Earl with zip ties. Earl's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. He was 53 years old and not in the best shape of his life, but he'd grown up in logging country and still had the strength that came from years of manual labor before he'd started driving. He feinted left, then drove his shoulder into the man on his right, sending him crashing into a desk. The second man grabbed for him, but Earl brought his knee up hard, catching the man in the solar plexus. Stop him! Horace shouted, reaching for something in his pocket. Earl burst through the door and ran toward his truck, his heart pounding. Behind him, he could hear shouting and footsteps. He had maybe 30 seconds before they caught up. His truck was still running. He'd left it idling, as most drivers did. He yanked open the door and hauled himself up into the cab in one motion, a move he hadn't made that quickly in years. In his mirrors, he could see Horace and several other men running toward him. Some of them had guns, not the kind DOT inspectors would ever carry. Earl slammed the truck into gear and laid on the air horn, the deafening blast echoing across the way station. Everybody get out! Get out now! He shouted into his CB as he started rolling forward. These ain't real inspectors! They're taking drivers hostage! Get out! The truck ahead of him wasn't moving. Earl could see the driver inside, frozen with indecision. Earl pulled alongside him, still laying on the horn. Move! 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 He screamed out his window. Finally, other drivers started to respond. Engines roared to life. Air horns blasted. The careful order of the truck queue dissolved into chaos as drivers realized they were in danger. Earl saw the refrigerated truck ahead of him lurch forward, the driver apparently deciding that whatever consequences came from leaving would be better than whatever was happening in that scale house. Earl followed, pushing his truck harder than was safe, feeling the loaded trailer sway dangerously as he took the curve back onto the interstate. In his mirrors, he could see other trucks following, a convoy of frightened drivers fleeing whatever had been planned for them. But he could also see that not all the trucks were moving. Some drivers, paralyzed by fear or confusion, remained in the queue, and the fake inspectors were regrouping, no longer maintaining their pretense of authority. Earl grabbed his CB microphone with a shaking hand. "Breaker, breaker. Emergency on I-5 northbound at Cascade Way Station. Armed men posing as DOT inspectors are taking drivers hostage. Need immediate police assistance. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." He repeated the message several times as he drove, his speedometer climbing past 70, then 75. Other drivers were joining in on the CB, confirming what they'd seen, warning approaching trucks to avoid the station. The airwaves erupted with chatter as the words spread up and down the interstate. About 10 miles from the way station, Earl finally felt safe enough to pull over at a rest area. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone as he called 911. Other drivers who'd escaped were pulling in around him, their faces showing the same mix of relief and terror that Earl felt. The California Highway Patrol arrived 15 minutes later, followed by Oregon State Police and eventually the FBI. Earl gave his statement multiple times, describing Horace, the fake inspectors, the drivers held captive inside the scale house. Other drivers corroborated his story, and soon the rest area looked like a crime scene investigation. It took 2 hours before they got word about what law enforcement had found at the way station. The fake inspectors were gone, having fled when they realized their operation had been blown. But they'd left behind 8 drivers, all zip-tied and traumatized but physically unharmed. They also left behind evidence of what they'd really been doing. The investigation revealed that the fake way station operation had been running for at least 6 weeks, though not continuously. The group would take over the closed station for a few hours at a time, usually during off-peak periods when traffic was lighter and response times from law enforcement would be longer. They'd been specifically targeting trucks carrying high-value cargo, electronics, pharmaceuticals, luxury goods, and using the fake inspections to gather intelligence about routes, security measures, and delivery schedules. Earl learned all this from Detective Patricia Rodriguez of the California Highway Patrol, who interviewed him 3 times in the week following the incident. She showed him photographs of the men he'd encountered, asking him to identify who did what, who seemed to be in charge, who appeared reluctant or coerced. "You're lucky, Mr. Henderson," Detective Rodriguez told him during their 3rd interview. "Your cargo didn't fit their target profile. Lumber isn't worth enough for the risk they were taking, but they couldn't let you go once you'd seen their operation." "What were they planning to do with us?" Earl asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Based on what the detained drivers told us and evidence we found at the scene, they would have held you until they'd finished processing all the high-value targets. Then..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The drivers would have been transported elsewhere. We found evidence suggesting connections to human trafficking operations." Earl felt sick. Human trafficking. These weren't just cargo thieves, Mr. Henderson. This was a sophisticated criminal organization with multiple revenue streams. Steal the valuable cargo, sell the truck and the driver. Well, there's always demand for forced labor, especially workers who already have specialized skills like commercial driving. The thought of what could have happened, what nearly did happen, kept Earl awake for weeks afterward. He'd replay the incident in his mind, wondering what would have occurred if he hadn't fought back, if he hadn't raised the alarm. How many drivers would have disappeared into whatever dark network these criminals operated? The man calling himself Inspector Horace Grayson was never found. The FBI discovered that the real Horace Grayson had been a DOT inspector who'd died 5 years earlier. Someone had stolen his identity, used his reputation and records to create a convincing fake persona. The other men involved were eventually identified as members of a West Coast crime syndicate with operations spanning from Mexico to Canada. 3 weeks after the incident, Earl was back on the road. His company had offered him time off, even suggested he might want to consider local routes instead of long haul, but Earl refused. He wouldn't let those criminals take his livelihood from him. But things were different now. He was different. Every way station became a source of anxiety. Every time he saw those flashing signs requiring commercial vehicles to enter, his hands would start sweating, his heart rate would spike. He'd verify the station's operational status on his phone, call ahead when possible, and always keep his doors locked until he was absolutely certain the inspectors were legitimate. One evening, about 2 months after the incident, Earl was approaching a way station on I-5 in Northern California. It was a different station, one he'd been through hundreds of times before, but as he pulled into the queue, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest. There were only 3 trucks ahead of him, and they were moving through quickly, but Earl couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He studied the inspectors through his windshield, looking for anything out of place. Their uniforms fit properly. Their movements were routine, professional. The equipment looked official. But Earl had learned that appearances meant nothing. The criminals at Cascade had looked official too. When it was his turn to cross the scales, Earl's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers went numb. The inspector waved him through without incident, but Earl didn't relax until he was miles away from the station. This was his new normal. Constant vigilance, perpetual suspicion, never quite feeling safe in places that should have been routine. 6 months after the Cascade incident, Earl received a call from Detective Rodriguez. They'd made arrests. Not the ringleaders, but several lower-level members of the organization. One of them had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony revealed the full scope of the operation. They'd been planning this for over a year, Detective Rodriguez explained. They had inside information from someone in the transportation department, someone who could tell them when stations would be closed, which inspectors were on vacation, all the details they needed to make their fake operation convincing. "Did you find the insider?" Earl asked. "Still working on it, but Mr. Henderson, I need to warn you about something. The man who testified mentioned your name specifically. You disrupted a major operation, cost them potentially millions of dollars. These people have long memories." Earl felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying you should be careful. Vary your routes when possible. Don't stick to predictable patterns. And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, don't hesitate to call law enforcement." The warning changed everything. Earl had already been struggling with anxiety about way stations, but now he had to worry about retaliation. He started carrying a gun, something he'd never done in over 2 decades of driving. He varied his routes, sometimes adding hours to his trips just to avoid predictability. He installed additional locks on his truck, security cameras, GPS trackers that would alert his family if he stopped moving for too long. But the worst part was the isolation. Earl had always been a social driver, someone who enjoyed the camaraderie of truck stops, the conversations over coffee at 3 a.m., the community of the road. Now he kept to himself, suspicious of friendly strangers, always wondering if that driver asking about his route was just making conversation or gathering intelligence. One night, parked at a truck stop in Oregon, Earl was startled awake by someone trying his door handle. His hand immediately went to the gun beside his bed, but before he could react, the person moved on. Through his curtain, he could see a figure checking other truck doors, probably just a common thief looking for an easy score. But Earl didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting up with his gun in his lap, watching the shadows move across his windshield. The paranoia was exhausting. Every unexpected knock on his door, every vehicle that seemed to follow him for too long, every unfamiliar face at a regular stop became a potential threat. His wife begged him to quit, to find a different job, But Earl was stubborn. He'd been driving trucks since he was 21 years old. It was all he knew, all he wanted to do. He wouldn't let criminals take that from him. A year after the Cascade incident, Earl got word that they'd finally arrested the ringleader. Not Horace, that identity remained a mystery, but the man who'd organized and funded the operation. He was caught in a different scheme, something involving stolen military equipment, and the investigation had led back to the way station plot. Detective Rodriguez called Earl with the news. "He's looking at federal charges, Mr. Henderson. Multiple life sentences. The organization is essentially dismantled." "What about Horace?" Earl asked. "Still in the wind. But without the organization backing him, he's just another fugitive. I don't think you need to worry about him anymore." But Earl did worry. Late at night, driving through the darkness with nothing but his headlights cutting through the void, he'd think about Horace out there somewhere. Did he blame Earl for ruining his operation? Was he planning revenge? Or had he moved on to other schemes, other victims? The encounter with the fake inspectors had taught Earl something that 23 years on the road hadn't. The thin line between order and chaos, between safety and danger, between legitimate authority and criminal deception. The uniforms, badges, and procedures that were supposed to protect drivers could be mimicked, weaponized, turned against them. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. Earl kept driving for another 2 years after the Cascade incident. But it was never the same. The joy was gone, replaced by a constant state of hypervigilance that left him exhausted and irritable. He started making mistakes, missing exits, forgetting to log hours properly, small things that added up over time. His company was understanding, but Earl knew he was becoming a liability. The final straw came at a way station in Washington State. It was a completely routine inspection, nothing suspicious about it at all. But as the inspector approached his truck, Earl had a panic attack. His vision tunneled, his chest felt like it was being crushed, and he couldn't breathe. The inspector, alarmed, called for medical assistance. Earl spent the night in a hospital, hooked up to monitors, being told by doctors that his body was fine, but his mind was struggling to process trauma. That's when Earl finally admitted what his wife, his dispatcher, and his friends had been telling him for months. He needed help. The criminals at Cascade had stolen more than just the cargo they'd targeted. They'd stolen Earl's sense of safety, his trust in the system, his love for the open road. Earl started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Slowly, painfully, he began to process what had happened to him. The therapist helped him understand that his hypervigilance, while exhausting, had been his mind's way of trying to protect him from a threat that had been very real. The paranoia, the anxiety, the constant fear, these weren't weaknesses. They were survival mechanisms that had outlived their usefulness. But understanding and overcoming were two different things. Earl still struggled with way stations, still felt his heart race when he saw DOT uniforms, still checked and rechecked the legitimacy of every official-looking person he encountered. The road, which had once been his freedom, had become his prison. 3 years after the Cascade incident, Earl made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He would go back to the Cascade way station, not to drive through it. The station remained closed, permanently shut down after what had happened, but to confront the place where his life had changed. His wife insisted on coming with him. They drove up in their personal vehicle on a clear October morning, the fall colors painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. As they approached the station, Earl felt his familiar anxiety rising, but also something else, a determination to reclaim this piece of highway from his nightmares. The way station looked abandoned. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. The scale house windows were boarded up. Graffiti covered the walls. The state had decided it was easier to build a new station elsewhere than to try to rehabilitate this one after what it had become synonymous with. Earl parked in the same spot where his truck had been that November day. He walked the path he'd taken to the scale house, remembering the moment he'd first seen Horace, the growing unease as things hadn't added up, the terror when he'd seen the other drivers zip-tied on the floor. "This is where I fought them off," he told his wife, standing by the door. "Right here. If I'd just gone along with it." "But you didn't," she said, taking his hand. "You saved yourself and those other drivers. You're a hero, Earl." Earl didn't feel like a hero. Heroes in movies walked away from their victories unchanged, ready for the next adventure. Earl had walked away broken, suspicious, unable to trust the very systems he'd relied on for over 2 decades. But standing there, in the place where it had all happened, he felt something shift inside him. The station wasn't a monster's lair. It was just an abandoned building. Horace and his crew weren't supernatural villains. They were criminals who'd been caught and punished. The fear Earl had been carrying wasn't protecting him anymore. It was just weighing him down. As they were leaving, Earl noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. There was a small memorial plaque that had been installed near the entrance to the station. It read, "In recognition of the brave drivers who stood against criminal deception and protected their fellow truckers, your courage saved lives." Below the inscription were 8 names, the 8 drivers who'd been held hostage and rescued thanks to Earl's actions. Earl's own name was at the bottom, set apart with the words, "Earl Henderson, the driver who sounded the alarm." Earl stood there for a long time, reading and rereading those words. He'd been so focused on what had been taken from him that he'd forgotten what he'd accomplished. 8 men had gone home to their families because Earl had fought back. How many more had been saved because the criminal operation had been exposed? On the drive home, Earl was quiet, processing everything he'd seen and felt. His wife didn't push him to talk, understanding that some journeys had to be traveled alone, even when you were sitting right next to someone. That night, Earl made a decision. He would return to trucking, but not as a long-haul driver. Instead, he would become a trainer, teaching new drivers not just how to handle their rigs, but how to stay safe in an industry where danger didn't always come from the obvious places. Earl's new role with his company put him in charge of safety training, with a special focus on security awareness. He developed a program called Trust But Verify, teaching drivers how to confirm the legitimacy of authority figures, how to recognize suspicious situations, and most importantly, how to respond when something didn't feel right. In his presentations, Earl would tell his story, not holding back the fear, the trauma, or the long recovery. He wanted new drivers to understand that the dangers they faced weren't just about jackknifed trailers or icy roads. Sometimes the danger came dressed in a uniform, carrying a clipboard, claiming to be there to help. "Your instincts are your best defense," Earl would tell his classes. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't be afraid to question authority. Don't be afraid to verify credentials. And don't ever be afraid to run if you need to." He taught them practical skills, how to verify if a way station was really open, how to check if an inspector's credentials were legitimate, how to maintain communication with dispatch during any official stop. But more than that, he taught them to trust themselves, to value their safety over compliance, to understand that no load, no deadline, no threat to their CDL was worth risking their lives. One day, about 6 months into his new role, Earl got an unexpected visitor. A young driver named Marcus came to his office, nervous and shaking. He'd just come from a way station where something hadn't felt right. The inspectors had seemed off, their questions too probing, their interest in his cargo too specific. Remembering Earl's training, Marcus had excused himself to use the bathroom, called dispatch to verify the station was really conducting inspections, and when he couldn't get confirmation, he'd left. "They threatened my license," Marcus said. "Said they'd make sure I never drove again, but I remembered what you said about trusting my instincts." Earl called his contacts at the Highway Patrol, and within hours they'd uncovered another fake inspection scam, this one targeting refrigerated trucks carrying pharmaceuticals. Marcus's vigilance had prevented another criminal operation from victimizing drivers. "You did the right thing," Earl told Marcus. "You potentially saved lives today." Seeing the impact of his training, knowing that his experience was helping protect other drivers, gave Earl a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before Cascade. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a guardian, watching out for the next generation of drivers. But the universe wasn't done testing Earl yet. It was a Thursday evening, nearly 4 years after the original incident, when Earl got a call from Detective Rodriguez. Her voice was tense, urgent. "Earl, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm," she began. "We've had a development in the Cascade case." Earl's blood ran cold. "What kind of development?" "The man you knew as Horace Grayson. We finally identified him. His real name is Harold Grimm, and Earl, he's been asking about you." "Asking about me? From prison?" "That's the thing, Earl. He's not in prison. He was never caught. But we've intercepted communications suggesting he's been tracking drivers who were involved in the Cascade incident. Your name came up multiple times." Earl sank into his chair, the old familiar fear creeping back. "What does he want?" "We don't know. But Earl, we have reason to believe he might try to make contact. We need you to be extra careful. We're assigning protection." "No," Earl interrupted. "No protection." "Earl, this is serious." "I know it's serious, but I'm not living in fear anymore. I've done that, and it nearly destroyed me. If Harold Grimm wants to find me, he will. Protection or no protection. But I'm not hiding." Detective Rodriguez tried to argue, but Earl was firm. He would take precautions. He would be vigilant. But he wouldn't let the ghost of Horace Grayson, or Harold Grimm, or whoever he really was, control his life again. 2 weeks passed without incident. Earl continued his training sessions, maintained his regular routines, though he did make some concessions to safety. He varied his routes to and from work, installed new security cameras at his home, and kept his gun within reach. But he refused to live like a prisoner. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, as Earl was leaving the company office after a late training session, he found someone waiting by his car. It was an old woman, hunched and frail, holding an umbrella against the rain. "Mr. Henderson?" she called out as he approached. Earl stopped, his hand moving instinctively toward his concealed weapon. "Can I help you?" "My name is Mildred Grimm," she said. "Harold is my son." Earl's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you want?" "To apologize," Mildred said, and Earl could see tears mixing with the rain on her weathered face. "And to warn you." Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Earl found himself listening to the old woman's story. Harold Grimm had been a real DEET inspector once, a good one, until a combination of gambling debts and a bitter divorce had driven him to corruption. What started as taking bribes to overlook violations had escalated into the elaborate criminal enterprise Earl had encountered. "He blames you for ruining everything," Mildred said. "But Mr. Henderson, you need to understand. My son is not well. He's obsessed with what happened at Cascade, convinced that if he can eliminate you, somehow he can rebuild what was lost." "Why are you telling me this?" Earl asked. "Because I've already lost my son to his choices," Mildred replied. "I don't want anyone else to suffer because of what he's become. He's planning something, Mr. Henderson. I don't know what, but he's been watching you, studying your new role, your training sessions." Earl felt the familiar cold grip of fear, but also something else. Pity for this old woman whose son had become a monster. "Do you know where he is?" Earl asked. Mildred shook her head. "He contacts me occasionally, but never from the same place twice. But, Mr. Henderson, he mentioned something about finishing where it started. I think I think he's planning something at a way station." The warning from Mildred Grimm changed everything. Earl immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez, who put together a task force to investigate the threat. They reviewed footage from way stations throughout California, Oregon, and Washington, looking for any sign of Harold Grimm. They monitored chatter in criminal networks, looking for any indication of a planned operation. But Harold was smart. He'd learned from his mistakes at Cascade. Whatever he was planning, he was keeping it close to the vest, not involving others who might betray him. The task force found nothing concrete, just shadows and rumors. Earl, meanwhile, struggled with the decision of whether to continue his training work. Every session he conducted put new drivers in the same room with him, potentially making them targets if Harold decided to strike. But backing down felt like letting Harold win, like giving him the power he sought over Earl's life. "I won't stop teaching," Earl told Detective Rodriguez during one of their strategy meetings. "These drivers need to know how to protect themselves. If anything, Harold's threat makes my work more important." Detective Rodriguez arranged for undercover officers to attend Earl's training sessions, blending in with the new drivers. Security was increased at the company facility. Earl's home was under surveillance, but everyone knew these measures were temporary. They couldn't maintain this level of protection indefinitely. 3 weeks after Mildred's warning, Earl was conducting a training session on recognizing fake credentials when one of the students raised his hand. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. "Mr. Henderson," the man said, "what if the fake inspector knows things about you that he shouldn't? Personal things?" Earl felt a prickle of unease, but maintained his professional demeanor. "That's a good question. Criminals often research their targets. They might know your route history, your company, even personal details they've gleaned from social media or public records. That's why it's important to—" "Like knowing about your daughter's wedding last spring?" the man interrupted. "Or your grandson's birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese? Or the fact that you take the same route home every Tuesday and Thursday?" The room went silent. Earl's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but the man raised his hands peacefully. "I'm not him," the man said quickly. "My name is Detective Ray Morrison, Oregon State Police. I'm here undercover. But if I could find out these things about you, Mr. Henderson, so can Harold Grimm." Earl relaxed slightly, but was shaken by the demonstration. The detective was right. Despite all his precautions, Earl had patterns, vulnerabilities, weak points that someone like Harold could exploit. After the session, Detective Morrison approached Earl privately. "We've been developing intelligence on Grimm," he said. "We think we know what he's planning." Morrison explained that they'd intercepted communications suggesting Harold was planning to recreate the Cascade incident, but with a twist. This time he wouldn't be after cargo or ransom. He'd be after revenge, and Earl would be the target. "He's been recruiting," Morrison said, "offering big money to criminals willing to pose as DIOT inspectors. But here's the thing. We think we can use this against him." The plan Morrison outlined was dangerous but potentially effective. They would leak information about a special training session Earl would be conducting at a specific way station, a hands-on demonstration of how to identify fake inspectors using the actual Cascade station as a teaching location. It would be irresistible bait for Harold, a chance to strike at Earl in the very place where his criminal empire had crumbled. "You'd be putting yourself at risk," Morrison said. "We'd have backup, of course, but there's no guarantee." "I'll do it," Earl said without hesitation. "I'm tired of waiting for him to make his move. Let's end this." The operation was scheduled for 2 weeks later. They spread the word through trucking networks about Earl's special training session at the old Cascade station, now supposedly reopened for educational purposes. They made it seem like Earl would be there with a small group of trainees, vulnerable and exposed. The night before the operation, Earl couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, looking at photos from his trucking days. There was one of him standing next to his first truck, young and eager, ready to conquer the highways. Another showed him at his million-mile celebration, surrounded by fellow drivers who'd become friends over the years. The road had given him so much, but it had also taken its toll. His wife found him there at 3 a.m. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I do," Earl replied. "Not for them, not even for me. For every driver who's going to pass through a way station tomorrow, next week, next year, they deserve to know that someone stood up to the Harold Grimms of the world." The next morning, Earl drove to the Cascade station with a convoy of what appeared to be training vehicles, but were actually filled with law enforcement officers. The station had been minimally restored for the operation, just enough to make it look functional from a distance. Earl set up in the scale house with 3 undercover officers posing as trainees. They went through the motions of a training session, Earl pointing out the various features of the facility, explaining how the criminals had operated, all while knowing that Harold could be watching, waiting for his moment. The first sign of trouble came around noon. A DOT vehicle pulled into the station. Not unusual, except that Detective Rodriguez had confirmed no legitimate inspectors were scheduled to be in the area. The vehicle parked, and 3 men in inspector uniforms got out. Earl recognized Harold immediately, even though he'd aged considerably in the 4 years since Cascade. His hair was completely gray now, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an intensity that spoke of obsession and madness. "Stay in character," one of the undercover officers whispered to Earl. "Let him come to us." Harold and his 2 accomplices approached the scale house with the same confident authority Harold had displayed years ago. But this time, Earl was ready. This time, he wasn't alone. Harold entered the scale house, and his eyes locked on Earl's. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Harold smiled, a cold expression that held no humor. "Mr. Henderson," Harold said, "I've been looking forward to this reunion." "Harold Grimm," Earl replied, surprised by how steady his voice was. "Or do you still prefer Inspector Grayson? Names are just tools, Mr. Henderson, like badges, like uniforms, like the trust that drivers place in authority, all tools to be used by those smart enough to wield them." The undercover officers tensed, ready to act, but Harold hadn't made any overtly threatening moves yet. He seemed content to talk, to savor the moment he'd been planning for years. "You cost me everything," Harold continued. "My operation, my associates, my freedom. I've spent 4 years thinking about this moment." "You cost yourself everything," Earl countered. "The moment you decided to prey on innocent drivers, you sealed your own fate." Harold's composure cracked slightly. "Innocent? Nobody's innocent in this world, Henderson. Everyone's looking for an angle, a way to get ahead. I just found a better angle than most." "You found a way to exploit people's trust," Earl said. "That's not clever. It's pathetic." That did it. Harold's face contorted with rage, and he reached inside his jacket. But before he could draw whatever weapon he was reaching for, the undercover officers moved. In seconds, Harold was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, his 2 accomplices in similar positions. But Harold was laughing, a sound that sent chills down Earl's spine. "You think you've won, Henderson? You think this ends with me in handcuffs?" Detective Rodriguez and her team swarmed the station, having been waiting for the signal. As Harold was hauled to his feet, he looked at Earl with those burning eyes. "Every fake inspector, every criminal targeting truckers, they all know your name now, Henderson. You're the man who brought down the Cascade operation. You're the one who taught drivers to resist. You've painted a target on your back that will never go away." As they dragged Harold away, Earl felt a mix of relief and dread. Harold was right about one thing. Earl had become a symbol, both to the drivers he protected and the criminals who preyed on them. But standing there in the scale house where it had all begun, Earl made a decision. He would continue teaching. He would continue protecting drivers. And if that made him a target, so be it. Because the alternative, letting fear win, letting the Harold Grimms of the world operate unopposed, was unacceptable. The operation at Cascade was hailed as a success. Harold Grimm was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, his accomplices receiving lesser sentences in exchange for testimony. The case became a textbook example of how law enforcement and the trucking community could work together to combat criminal exploitation. Earl's training program was adopted industry-wide, with thousands of drivers learning the trust but verify protocols he'd developed. Weigh stations across the country implemented new security measures to prevent fake inspector schemes. The Cascade incident, once a source of trauma and fear, became a catalyst for positive change in the industry. But late at night, when Earl was alone with his thoughts, he would remember Harold's final words. The target on his back might never go away, but Earl had learned to live with it. Every driver who went home safe because of his training, every criminal operation exposed because drivers knew what to look for, every life saved because someone had the courage to question authority. These were Earl's answer to the Harold Grimms of the world. The road would always have its dangers. There would always be predators looking to exploit trust and authority. But now, thanks to Earl and the drivers who'd stood with him, the trucking community was ready. They were vigilant. They were prepared. And most importantly, they were no longer afraid. 5 years after the original Cascade incident, Earl stood once again at the abandoned way station. But this time, he wasn't alone. Hundreds of drivers had gathered for a memorial service, honoring not just those who'd been victims of criminal schemes, but celebrating those who'd fought back. Earl spoke to the crowd, his voice carrying across the gathering. "This place tried to break us," he said. "It tried to use our respect for authority against us. It tried to make us victims, but we refused. We stood together. We protected each other. And that's what we'll continue to do every day, on every highway, at every way station." The crowd erupted in applause, air horns blasting from the assembled trucks. Earl looked out at the sea of drivers, young and old, experienced and rookie, all united in their determination to keep their community safe. Mildred Grimm was in the crowd, having come to apologize again for her son's actions. Earl had told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she wasn't responsible for Harold's choices. She'd wept then, grateful for a forgiveness she didn't think she deserved. As the memorial service concluded and drivers began returning to their trucks, Earl walked one more time through the abandoned station. The ghosts of that November day were still there, but they no longer haunted him. They'd become part of his story, part of his strength. A young driver approached him, nervous and eager. "Mr. Henderson, I just wanted to say thank you. Your training saved me last week. Fake inspector tried to get me to open my trailer at a closed rest area. I remembered what you taught us, verified his credentials were bogus, and got out of there." Earl smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in that place. "You saved yourself, son. I just gave you the tools." As Earl walked back to his car, his wife waiting patiently, he took one last look at the Cascade way station. It would always be the place where his life changed, where his faith in the system was shattered. But it was also the place where he'd found his purpose, where he'd discovered that one driver's courage could inspire an entire industry to stand up against exploitation. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, on highways across America, drivers were beginning their night runs, navigating the darkness with loads that kept the country running. They faced dangers Earl knew all too well, but they were no longer facing them unprepared. Earl had given them something more valuable than any cargo. The knowledge that their instincts mattered, that their safety came first, and that questioning authority wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. The road stretched on, endless and full of possibilities, both good and bad. But Earl Henderson, the driver who'd sounded the alarm at the Cascade Way station, had helped ensure that the good had a fighting chance. As he drove away with his wife, Earl turned on the CB radio one more time. The chatter was familiar, comforting. Drivers sharing information, warning each other about hazards, just watching out for one another. "This is Big Blue, signing off," Earl said into the microphone. "Drive safe out there, drivers. And remember, trust, but always verify." The responses came back immediately, dozens of drivers acknowledging his message, thanking him, wishing him well. Earl smiled, turned off the radio, and headed home. The highway would always be there, waiting. But now, thanks to one driver's courage on a November day at a way station that shouldn't have been open, it was a little bit safer for everyone who traveled it. Chester had been driving the coastal routes of the Pacific Northwest for 15 years, and he thought he'd seen every kind of weather the region could throw at him. Rain that fell sideways, snow that turned highways into skating rinks, and wind that could push a fully loaded trailer into the next lane. But the fog was different. The fog on Highway 101 through the coastal mountains of Northern California was something else entirely. A living thing that could swallow the world whole and leave you driving through nothing but gray void. It was early December, and Chester was hauling a load of fresh seafood from Eureka down to San Francisco, time-sensitive cargo that needed to reach the fish markets before dawn. He'd left Eureka at midnight, planning to make the run in about 5 hours if the weather cooperated. The forecast had mentioned possible fog in the coastal mountains, but Chester had driven through fog before. How bad could it be? The first wisps appeared around 1 a.m. just south of Fortuna, thin tendrils of mist that danced across the highway like ghosts. Chester turned on his fog lights and reduced his speed from 65 to 55, standard procedure for limited visibility. His 2016 Volvo VNL was equipped with all the modern safety features: collision avoidance systems, lane departure warnings, adaptive cruise control. But Chester knew that technology was no substitute for caution in weather like this. By the time he reached the Richardson Grove area, the fog had thickened considerably. What had been wisps were now walls of gray that seemed to pulse and breathe around his truck. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet, then 30, then 20. Chester slowed to 35 miles per hour, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to keep the center line in view. The CB radio crackled with static. Other drivers were out there in the fog, their voices cutting in and out as they warned each other about the conditions. "Southbound at mile marker 672. Visibility near zero, taking it slow. Northbound passing Piercy, can't see more than 1 truck length ahead. This fog ain't natural, boys. Seen a lot of weather, but this is something else." Chester keyed his mic. "Southbound hauling seafood coming up on Leggett. Anyone know how far south this soup goes?" There was a pause, then a voice Chester didn't recognize came through, clear despite the static that plagued everyone else's transmissions. "It goes all the way down, driver. All the way to where you need to be." Something about the voice made Chester uneasy. It was too calm, too clear, and what kind of answer was that anyway? He tried to respond, ask for clarification, but his radio just produced static. The fog grew denser as he climbed into the mountains. Highway 101 twisted and turned through the redwood forests, a challenging drive even in perfect conditions. Now, with visibility down to maybe 10 feet, every curve was a leap of faith. Chester's speed dropped to 20, then 15. His seafood delivery deadline was shot, but that was the least of his worries now. That's when he saw the taillights ahead. 2 red glows in the gray murk, maybe 20 feet in front of him. Another vehicle, moving at about the same crawling pace. Chester felt a wave of relief. Following another vehicle was dangerous in fog, but having any point of reference was better than driving blind. He maintained a safe following distance, using the taillights as his guide through the serpentine mountain road. The vehicle ahead seemed to know the route well, taking the curves smoothly, never wavering. Chester found himself relaxing slightly, falling into the rhythm of following those red lights through the gray. After about 30 minutes of this careful procession, Chester realized something was wrong. They should have reached the town of Leggett by now, but there were no signs of civilization. No streetlights, no buildings, no intersections, just the endless fog and the winding road and those two red lights always exactly the same distance ahead. Chester checked his GPS, but the screen showed an error message. Signal lost. His phone had no service. The only working instrument was his compass, and that was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. He tried the CB again. "Anyone out there? This is southbound seafood truck, looking for a position check. Where the hell are we?" Static. Then that same calm voice from before. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be, Chester." Chester's blood ran cold. He hadn't given his name over the radio. "Who is this?" he demanded. "How do you know my name?" "We all know each other out here in the fog, Chester. We've all been driving these roads together for so long. Don't you remember?" Chester definitely didn't remember, and the voice was starting to sound less human with each word, like it was being filtered through water or spoken by someone who'd forgotten how vocal cords were supposed to work. The taillights ahead suddenly swerved, and Chester instinctively followed, his truck leaning hard as he navigated what felt like a hairpin turn. But Highway 101 didn't have any hairpin turns in this section. The road was winding, but not that extreme. Where was he? That's when Chester noticed something that made his hands shake on the steering wheel. The trees visible at the edge of his headlight beams weren't right. They were too tall, too thick, and they were moving. Not swaying in wind, but actually moving, their trunks writhing like massive snakes. "No," Chester said aloud, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. "It's just the fog playing tricks. Trees don't move." But they did move, and as he watched, one of them bent down across the road behind him, its massive trunk blocking any possibility of retreat. He was being herded forward, following those taillights deeper into wherever this fog had taken him. The radio crackled again, and this time multiple voices came through, all speaking in unison. "Welcome to the Eternal Highway, Chester. You've been expected." Chester's rational mind, the part that had kept him safe through 15 years of professional driving, was screaming at him that none of this was possible. Fog couldn't transport you to another place. Trees didn't move. Radios didn't know your name. But the evidence of his senses was undeniable. The tail lights ahead began to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer in a hypnotic rhythm. Chester found it hard to look away, hard to think about anything except following those lights. Part of him wanted to stop, to refuse to go any further, but he could hear engines behind him now. Other vehicles that had entered the fog and were following him just as he was following the lights ahead. Then he saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, clearly visible despite the fog that obscured everything else. She was middle-aged, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1950s, and she was waving frantically, trying to flag him down. Chester's first instinct was to stop and help, but something about the woman was wrong. She wasn't affected by the fog at all. He could see her perfectly clearly from 100 feet away, while everything else was hidden in gray. And her movements were too repetitive, like a video loop playing over and over. Wave, step forward, wave, step back, wave, step forward. Always exactly the same. As he passed her, Chester glimpsed her face clearly in his side mirror. Her mouth was open in a scream, but no sound came out. Her eyes were solid black, like pools of oil. And then she reset, back to the starting position, waving at the next vehicle in line. "Don't stop for her. the radio voice advised. "Agnes has been trying to leave for 60 years. She can't. Neither can you now. Just follow the lights, Chester. It's easier if you don't fight it." Agnes, the thing pretending to be a woman, had a name. That somehow made it worse. Chester's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He'd entered a fog bank on Highway 101, a normal if severe weather condition. But somewhere in that gray shroud, he'd crossed into something else. Another dimension? A parallel reality? A supernatural trap? The specifics didn't matter as much as the growing certainty that he was in serious danger. The road began to descend, which was wrong. Highway 101 climbed steadily through this section, gaining elevation as it crossed the coastal range. But Chester was definitely going downhill now, his jakebrake growling as he controlled his speed on the grade. The fog started to thin slightly, revealing more of the landscape, and Chester wished it hadn't. The forest around him was wrong in every way. The trees were impossibly tall, their tops lost in darkness above the fog. Things moved between the trunks, large things that didn't match any animal Chester knew. And the road itself was changing, the asphalt becoming older, more cracked with each mile, as if he was driving backwards through time. The tail lights ahead suddenly accelerated, pulling away into the fog. Chester pressed his accelerator to follow, but the lights disappeared entirely, leaving him alone on the deteriorating road. Behind him, the other vehicles that had been following were gone too. The convoy that had formed in the fog had dissolved, leaving Chester in solitude with only the gray mist for company. He checked his fuel gauge, 3/4 full, same as when he'd entered the fog 2 hours ago. His odometer hadn't moved either, still showing the same mileage as when he'd passed Fortuna. According to his instruments, he hadn't actually driven anywhere despite the clear sensation of movement and the changing landscape around him. "This isn't real," Chester said to himself, his voice sounding small in the cab of his truck. "This can't be real." "Reality is subjective here," the radio responded, though Chester hadn't keyed his mic. "What's real is what you experience. And you're experiencing this, aren't you, Chester?" "What do you want?" Chester demanded. "Why is this happening?" "The fog needs drivers," the voice explained, its tone patient like a teacher with a slow student. "The eternal highway requires those who know the roads, who understand the rhythm of the journey. You've been selected, Chester. Chosen. You should be honored." "Honored? I'm trapped in some kind of nightmare." "Nightmare? Dream? Reality? These distinctions matter less than you think. What matters is that you're here now, part of the eternal procession. Fighting it only makes the transition harder." Chester slowed his truck to a crawl, looking for any landmark, any sign that might tell him where he was. The road had deteriorated to the point where it was more gravel than asphalt, and the fog had taken on a yellowish tinge, like old newspaper. Then he saw the gas station. It appeared out of the fog like a mirage. An old Sinclair station with the green dinosaur logo, pumps that belonged in a museum, and a small office with lights glowing warmly inside. Chester knew he shouldn't stop, knew that nothing in this fog could be trusted, but he was desperate for any human contact that might help him understand what was happening. He pulled into the station, his modern truck looking absurdly out of place next to the vintage pumps. The moment he stopped, a man emerged from the office, elderly, wearing coveralls and a Sinclair cap, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd repeated the same actions thousands of times. "Evening, driver," the man said, approaching Chester's window. His voice was thin, reedy, like it was coming from very far away. "Or is it morning? Hard to tell in the fog." "Where am I?" Chester asked. "What is this place?" The old man, Elmer, according to his name patch, tilted his head. "You're at the Sinclair station on Highway 101, of course. Though which Highway 101 and when..." Well, that's a more complicated question. When? What do you mean, when? Elmer sighed, leaning against Chester's truck. Up close, Chester could see that the man's eyes were clouded with cataracts, yet he moved as if he could see perfectly. The fog doesn't just obscure distance, driver. It obscures time. Past, present, future. They all exist simultaneously here. You're driving through every moment this road has ever known, all at once. That's impossible. Is it? Elmer asked. You've seen Agnes, haven't you? She crashed on this road in 1961, trying to get to her daughter's wedding. She's been flagging down help ever since, existing in the moment before impact, forever. And me? I've been running this station since 1952, or at least that's when I started. Can't seem to stop. The fog won't let me. Chester's mind reeled. So, everyone here is dead? Dead, alive, somewhere in between. Categories lose meaning in the fog. What matters is that we're all part of the highway now, serving our purpose in the eternal procession. What about the taillights I was following? Who was that? Elmer's expression darkened. Best not to think about that too hard. Some things in the fog are better left unexamined. You follow the lights because that's what drivers do. Where they lead, well, every driver finds out eventually. I need to get out of here, Chester said. I have a delivery to make. I have a life outside this fog. We all had lives outside, Elmer said sadly. Jobs, families, destinations. But the fog chose us, and now we serve a different purpose. You'll understand in time. They all do. Chester started his engine. I'm not staying here. There has to be a way out. Elmer stepped back, that same sad expression on his weathered face. Drive safely, Chester. The fog is patient, but it doesn't like those who resist too strongly. And watch out for the ones who've been here longest. They're not quite human anymore. Chester pulled out of the station, looking back to see Elmer still standing there, watching him go. Then the fog closed in again, and the station vanished as if it had never existed. The road continued to deteriorate as Chester drove. The pavement gave way to packed dirt, then to barely visible ruts and grass. His truck bounced and shook, the sophisticated suspension struggling with terrain it was never designed for. The fog changed colors, yellow to green to a sickly purple that hurt to look at directly. The CB radio burst to life with a cacophony of voices, all talking at once. Been driving for 30 years, can't stop, can't. My children must be grown by now, do they remember? The lights lead down, always down to where the road began. Don't trust the mechanic. He takes more than he fixes. Chester turned off the radio, but the voices continued, coming through despite the power being cut. He pulled the radio's fuse, and still they spoke, a chorus of the lost and trapped, all drivers who'd entered the fog and never left. His truck's headlights began to flicker, which should have been impossible with the modern LED system. But nothing was impossible here, Chester was learning. The lights dimmed and brightened in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code, though Chester didn't know Morse well enough to decipher it. Then he saw the roadblock ahead. 3 vehicles were positioned across the road, a 1940s delivery truck, a 1960s sedan, and a modern SUV that looked like it had been abandoned yesterday. Or tomorrow. Time meant nothing here. Behind the vehicles stood figures in various clothing from different eras, all watching Chester's approach with hollow eyes. Chester stopped about 50 feet from the roadblock. The figures didn't move, just stood there watching, waiting. He considered trying to drive around them, but the forest pressed close on both sides, those writhing trees that weren't really trees forming an impenetrable barrier. You need to choose, the radio said, even though it had no power. Forward into acceptance or back into resistance. But know that the fog has already claimed you, Chester. You entered of your own free will. That's all the permission it needs. Chester looked in his mirrors. The road behind him was gone, swallowed by fog so thick it looked solid. There was literally nowhere to go but forward, through the roadblock and whatever lay beyond. He put the truck in gear and crept forward. The figures at the roadblock didn't move until he was almost upon them. Then they stepped aside in perfect synchronization, creating just enough space for his truck to pass through. As he drove between them, Chester glimpsed their faces, or what remained of them. They'd been human once, but prolonged exposure to the fog had changed them. Their features were blurred, as if someone had tried to erase them but hadn't quite finished the job. Beyond the roadblock, the road improved slightly, becoming gravel again. The fog thinned enough that Chester could see perhaps 100 feet ahead, and what he saw made him slam on his brakes. The road ended at a cliff, not a normal cliff, but a drop into absolute nothingness, a void where the fog itself seemed to pour over the edge like a waterfall. The taillights he'd been following earlier were there, right at the edge, still pulsing with that hypnotic rhythm. But now Chester could see that they weren't attached to any vehicle. They were just lights, floating in space, luring drivers to the edge and over. "This is the choice," the radio voice said. "Drive over and become one with the eternal highway, or turn back and drive the fog roads forever, never reaching any destination, never escaping, slowly becoming like those you passed at the roadblock." Chester sat in his truck, engine idling, staring at the void. His rational mind told him this was all impossible, that he was hallucinating or dreaming or had crashed somewhere back in the real fog. And this was his dying brain's attempt to make sense of things. But his hands on the steering wheel were real. The seafood in his trailer was real. He could hear the refrigeration unit humming. His fear was definitely real. "There has to be another way," Chester said to the voice in the radio. "There's always another way," the voice replied. "But it requires sacrifice. Are you willing to give up something precious to escape the fog?" "What kind of sacrifice?" "The fog feeds on memory, Chester. Give it your memories of the road, all of them. Every mile you've driven, every destination you've reached, every moment behind the wheel. Become someone who's never driven before, and the fog will have no claim on you." Chester sat at the edge of the void, considering the impossible choice. Give up his memories of driving, 15 years of experience, knowledge, and identity, or accept one of the fog's two endings: dissolution in the void, or eternal wandering on roads that led nowhere. His memories of the road weren't just professional experience. They were late-night conversations with other drivers, sunrises over mountain passes, the satisfaction of delivering critical supplies to communities that depended on truckers. They were who he was. Without them, would he even be Chester anymore? "I need time to think," Chester said to the radio. "Time is the one thing you have in abundance here," the voice replied. "The fog is patient." Chester put his truck in reverse and backed away from the cliff, then turned around and headed back toward the roadblock. The figures were gone, the abandoned vehicles too. The road stretched empty in both directions, though Chester knew that was an illusion. There was no real direction here, no actual destination, just the endless loop of fog-shrouded roads. He drove for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes or days. His fuel gauge never moved. His body never grew tired or hungry. The fog had suspended all normal biological needs, keeping him in a state of perpetual alertness, forever able to drive, but never able to arrive. Eventually, he came upon another driver. The truck was pulled over on what passed for a shoulder, hazard lights blinking. It was an old Peterbilt from the 1970s, painted in colors that had faded to suggestions of their former glory. The driver was standing beside it, an older black man in his 60s, wearing clothes that looked contemporary. "You're new," the man said as Chester pulled up alongside him. It wasn't a question. "Few hours," Chester replied. Maybe. Hard to tell. Gets easier, or harder. Depends on your perspective. The man extended his hand through Chester's window. Name's Marcus. Been here since 1987. Or maybe I arrived yesterday. Time's funny in the fog. Chester shook his hand, surprised by how solid and warm it felt. Chester. 2023, I think. Though that might not mean anything here. Marcus laughed, a sound that seemed too normal for this place. It means something. You're the most recent arrival I've met. Means the fog is still hunting, still hungry. You've been here for decades? By some measurements. But I've learned things, Chester. The fog isn't evil, exactly. It's just necessary. Every road needs its ghosts, its legends, its warnings. We're part of the infrastructure now, as essential as the asphalt and the mile markers. That's insane. Is it? Think about all the trucking stories you've heard. Phantom drivers, mysterious helpers, warnings from nowhere. Where do you think they come from? We're the ones who flash our lights to warn about speed traps we passed 30 years ago. We're the voices on the CB telling drivers to check their brakes before descents that killed us. We're the guardian angels and the cautionary tales. Chester stared at Marcus, trying to process this. So we're stuck here to help other drivers? Some of us. Others become the hazards, like Agnes, forever trying to flag down help, causing accidents as drivers swerve to avoid her, or the taillights that lead to the cliff. The fog uses us according to our nature. And what's your nature? Marcus smiled sadly. I'm a warner. I try to help new arrivals understand their situation, maybe make better choices than I did. I drove off that cliff my first day here, thinking it would end things. Instead, I just became more bound to the fog. Now I can't leave this stretch of road, can't do anything but wait for drivers like you and try to explain. The voice on the radio said I could escape if I gave up my driving memories. Marcus's expression grew serious. That voice. Be careful with that one. It's not lying, but it's not telling the whole truth either. Yes, you can escape by giving up your road memories, but without those memories, you won't know how to drive. You'll be free of the fog, but unable to work, unable to support yourself. The fog knows this. It offers escape that's really just another kind of trap. Then what do I do? There's a third option, Marcus said, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. But it's dangerous, and I've only heard of one driver who managed it. Tell me. The fog has rules. It can only hold those who entered willingly, and it can only keep those who accept its reality. If you can prove that this place doesn't exist, that it violates the fundamental laws of physics, the fog has to release you. How do I prove something doesn't exist while I'm inside it? By creating a paradox the fog can't resolve. Something so impossible that even this impossible place can't contain it. Marcus walked closer to Chester's truck, lowering his voice. The driver who escaped. He figured out that the fog exists in all times simultaneously. Past, present, future all at once. So he did something that created a temporal impossibility. What did he do? He met himself, the younger version who was about to enter the fog, warned himself not to enter. Created a paradox. If he never entered, he couldn't warn himself, but if he didn't warn himself, he would enter. The fog couldn't resolve it and had to expel him from both timelines. Chester felt a spark of hope. So I need to find the Chester who's about to enter the fog and warn him? If you can. But navigating the fog's temporal maze isn't easy, and the fog will try to stop you once it realizes what you're attempting. It doesn't like to lose drivers. Chester thanked Marcus and drove on, his mind racing with this new possibility. He needed to find the moment he'd entered the fog, intercept himself before he'd crossed whatever threshold had trapped him here. But how do you navigate to a specific moment in a place where all moments existed simultaneously? The answer came from an unexpected source. His truck's GPS, which had been showing error messages, suddenly displayed a map, not of roads, but of times. Lines of temporal force crisscrossing the fog, showing when various moments intersected. And there, highlighted in red, was a convergence point labeled Entry, Chester, December 5th, 2023, 1:07 a.m. Chester followed the GPS's new guidance, turning onto roads that shouldn't exist, driving through fog that changed from gray to silver to a strange prismatic shimmer that showed him glimpses of other times. He saw Highway 101 being built, saw ancient forests before any road existed, saw futures where the highway had been reclaimed by nature. Then he saw himself. His truck, the same Volvo VNL, the same seafood load, approaching the fog bank from the north. Chester checked his clock. 1:05 a.m., December 5th, 2023. 2 minutes before he'd entered the fog. He accelerated, pulling alongside his past self, seeing his own face through the driver's side window, focused on the road, unaware of what was about to happen. Chester grabbed his CB microphone, tuning to channel 19. Volvo hauling seafood. Southbound at mile marker 681. This is an emergency warning. Do not enter the fog ahead. Repeat, do not enter the fog. He watched his past self pick up the mic, confusion evident on his face. Who is this? How do you know what I'm hauling? Listen to me very carefully, Chester said, pulling ahead so his past self could see the identical truck. I'm you. 2 hours from now. The fog ahead isn't natural. It's a trap. If you enter it, you'll never leave. Turn around now. Take Highway 299 east to I-5. It'll add 3 hours to your route, but you'll make it to San Francisco. Past Chester's face went through a series of expressions. Disbelief, fear, recognition. He was looking at the identical truck, the identical license plate, the impossible made visible. This is some kind of trick, past Chester said, but his voice was shaking. Your wife's name is Patricia. You've been married 12 years. Your daughter Emma just started college at Oregon State. You're hauling 20,000 pounds of salmon and halibut for Fisherman's Wharf markets. Your dispatcher is Tom Martinez, and he still owes you $50 from that poker game last month. Need more proof? Past Chester was slowing down now, his truck falling back. The fog bank loomed ahead, a wall of gray reaching across the highway like grasping fingers. If you're really me, past Chester said, tell me something only I would know. Chester thought quickly. You're thinking about retiring in 5 years, buying that fishing boat you've had your eye on, the 1987 Grady White. You haven't told Patricia yet because you're not sure she'll approve of spending that much, but you've already picked out a name for it. Second Wind. That did it. Past Chester hit his brakes, his truck slowing to a stop just yards from the fog bank. Chester watched his past self sit there, staring at the wall of gray, then slowly begin to reverse, to turn around. The moment past Chester's truck headed north, away from the fog, the world around Chester exploded. The fog screamed, not with sound, but with vibration that Chester felt in his bones. The road beneath him cracked and split. The trees writhed more violently, reaching for his truck with branch fingers. The radio erupted with 1,000 voices, all shouting at once. Paradox! Violation! Impossible! Chester's truck shook as if caught in an earthquake. His windshield cracked. Warning lights flashed across his dashboard. The GPS screen showed temporal lines colliding, fracturing, creating a spiderweb of impossibility centered on his location. You cannot do this! The original radio voice roared, no longer calm but filled with rage. You are ours! You entered willingly! You cannot leave! But Chester could feel it, the fog's grip weakening, its reality becoming unstable. By preventing himself from entering, he'd created an irreconcilable paradox. He existed in the fog, but he'd never entered the fog. He was both trapped and free, present and absent. The void he'd seen earlier appeared in front of him, not at a cliff's edge but in the middle of the road, a hole in reality itself. It was pulling him in, but not toward dissolution, toward expulsion. The fog was ejecting him like a body rejecting a transplanted organ that didn't match. Chester pressed the accelerator, driving straight into the void. The sensation of passing through the void was like being turned inside out, while simultaneously compressed to a single point and stretched across infinity. Chester's consciousness fragmented, experiencing every moment of his driving career simultaneously. His first time behind the wheel of a big rig, every delivery, every sunrise, every cup of truck stop coffee, all at once. Then, suddenly, he was through. Chester found himself parked on the shoulder of Highway 101 just south of Leggett. His truck was off, the engine cold. The fog was gone, replaced by a clear night sky filled with stars. His phone showed 3:47 a.m., December 5th, 2023. According to the timestamp, only 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed since he'd entered the fog. His hands were shaking as he checked his GPS. It showed his location normally, no temporal maps or impossible readings. His CB radio was silent except for the normal late-night chatter of other drivers. Everything seemed normal. Had it been real? Or had he pulled over to rest and experienced the most vivid nightmare of his life? Then he noticed his windshield. A crack ran across it in a pattern that matched exactly what had happened when the fog had screamed. His fuel gauge showed the same 3/4 full it had throughout his time in the fog, despite having driven what felt like hundreds of miles. And on his CB radio, stuck to the handset, was a note he didn't remember placing there. "Remember us. Marcus." Chester sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Then he started his truck and continued south toward San Francisco. His seafood load was still fresh, still on time for delivery. To anyone checking his electronic logs, it would look like he'd taken a brief rest stop, nothing more. But as he drove, Chester noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. Wisps of fog that seemed to reach toward his truck before pulling back. Shadows by the roadside that might have been waving figures. CB transmissions that cut in and out. Voices that sounded familiar but impossible. He made his delivery in San Francisco without incident, collected his paperwork, and headed back north. But when he reached the area where he'd encountered the fog, he took Highway 299 east to I-5, adding 3 hours to his route. He would always take the longer route from then on. 3 days later, Chester was at a truck stop in Oregon when another driver approached him, a young woman who looked exhausted and frightened. "Excuse me," she said. "This is going to sound crazy, but were you driving southbound on 101 3 nights ago, around 1 a.m.? Chester's blood chilled. "Why do you ask?" "Because I was northbound, and I saw something impossible. 2 identical trucks, and one of them warned the other about fog. I entered that fog bank right after and—" She paused, tears forming in her eyes. "I lost 6 hours. I don't remember anything except gray and voices and this feeling like I was being pulled somewhere else." "You got out?" "I don't know how. One moment I was lost, the next I was parked at a rest area with no memory of stopping. But ever since, I keep seeing things. Shadows that don't match their sources. Radio voices that know my name. And last night I saw a woman by the road trying to flag me down, but she kept resetting like a broken video." Chester looked at the young driver, probably no more than 25, new to the profession, terrified by something she couldn't explain. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jennifer." "Jennifer, let me buy you a cup of coffee. There are some things you need to know about the fog." They sat in the truck stop diner until dawn, Chester explaining everything he'd experienced, everything Marcus had told him, everything he'd learned about the fog's nature and rules. Jennifer listened, her expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally, a kind of grim acceptance. "So it's still out there," she said, "waiting for more drivers." "Always has been. Probably always will be. The fog is part of the road now. Maybe has been since the first paths were cut through these mountains. But we can warn others. We can watch for the signs. We can help." Jennifer nodded slowly. "Those voices on the CB, the ones that know things they shouldn't, are they all trapped drivers?" "Some of them. Others are like Marcus, trying to help. And some." Chester paused, remembering the tail lights leading to the cliff. "Some have become something else. Something dangerous." Over the following months, Chester started noticing more drivers who'd had encounters with the fog. Most had lost only a few hours, escaping before being fully trapped. But they all described the same things: the voices, the moving trees, the woman who kept resetting, the feeling of being pulled into something vast and hungry. He started an informal network, drivers who'd experienced the fog watching out for others, warning about the danger zones, sharing information about when and where the fog was strongest. They called themselves the Fog Watchers, and their numbers grew steadily. One night, 6 months after his escape, Chester was driving a different route entirely, I-5 through Oregon, when his CB crackled to life with a familiar voice. "Chester, this is Marcus. Can you hear me?" Chester grabbed his mic, his heart racing. "Marcus? How are you reaching me? I'm nowhere near 101. "The fog extends further than you know, friend. Its roads connect to all roads eventually. I'm calling to warn you. The fog remembers you. It remembers what you did, and it's angry." "What do you mean?" "You showed others how to escape. You created a network of watchers. The fog sees this as theft, taking what it considers rightfully claimed. It's going to try to reclaim you, Chester. Not just you, but all the fog watchers." "How?" "It's learning to extend beyond the coastal routes, patches of fog that appear on clear nights, sections of road that don't match the maps. Drivers are disappearing again, but not just on 101. Be careful, Chester. Watch for the signs, and whatever you do, don't follow any tail lights you don't recognize." The transmission ended with static, and Chester couldn't raise Marcus again. But the warning proved prophetic. Over the next few weeks, fog watchers reported encounters across the West Coast. Not just California, but Oregon, Washington, even inland into Nevada and Idaho. The fog was spreading, or maybe it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to expand its hunting grounds. Chester found himself at the center of an underground movement of drivers sharing information, posting warnings, developing strategies to identify and avoid the fog's traps. They created codes for the CB, signals to warn other drivers without sounding crazy to those who hadn't experienced it. 3 clicks of the mic meant fog ahead. 5 meant someone had disappeared. 7 was a call for all fog watchers to converge and attempt a rescue. But the fog adapted too. It learned their codes, mimicked their voices, created false warnings to lure drivers into traps. It was an arms race between an entity that existed outside normal reality and a group of truckers trying to protect their own. One night, Chester received a call from Jennifer. She was crying, barely coherent. "Chester, I saw him. My partner, David. He entered the fog 3 hours ago on 101 near Crescent City. I tried to warn him, but he thought I was being paranoid. The fog took him." "Where are you now?" "At the same spot. I can see the fog bank. It's just sitting there, waiting. Chester, I can hear him on the CB. He's calling for help, but his voice, it sounds wrong. Like he's already changing. Chester was 4 hours away, but he started driving immediately. He put out the 7-click signal, and within minutes, other fog watchers were responding, converging on Jennifer's location. When Chester arrived, there were 8 trucks lined up along the highway, their lights piercing into a wall of fog that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Jennifer was standing with the other drivers, her face drawn with fear and determination. "He's still in there," she said. "I can hear him every few minutes, but he doesn't sound human anymore." Chester approached the fog wall, stopping just inches from its surface. This close, he could see that it wasn't uniform. There were patterns in it, swirls and eddies that suggested movement within, and there were shapes, vague suggestions of vehicles and figures moving through the gray. "David," Chester called out. "David, if you can hear me, drive toward my voice." For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly, they heard an engine approaching. Headlights appeared in the fog, growing brighter. But as the vehicle emerged, Chester's hope turned to horror. It was David's truck, but it had been changed. The metal was partially translucent, as if it existed only partially in this reality. And David himself, visible through the cab window, was transforming. His features were blurring, becoming indistinct, matching those entities Chester had seen at the roadblock months ago. David's truck stopped halfway out of the fog, unable or unwilling to fully emerge. Through the CB, his voice came through, distorted and hollow. "Can't leave part of it now. The fog needs drivers. Always needs more." Jennifer started toward the truck, but Chester caught her arm. "That's not David anymore. Not entirely. If you touch him, the fog might claim you too. We can't just leave him." "We can try one thing," Chester said. He turned to the assembled fog watchers. "Everyone, turn on your lights. High beams, fog lights, everything. And start your engines." 8 trucks roared to life, their combined lights creating a wall of illumination that pushed against the fog. The fog recoiled, pulling back like a living thing avoiding pain. David's truck was pulled further out, and for a moment, Chester thought they might free him. But then the fog pushed back. It surged forward. Not just gray mist, but something darker, thicker, more substantial. It engulfed David's truck entirely, and when it receded, the truck was gone. No trace, no sound, nothing. David had been reclaimed. Jennifer fell to her knees, sobbing. The other fog watchers stood in stunned silence. They'd lost one of their own, despite all their precautions and knowledge. Chester helped Jennifer to her feet. "We need to leave, now. The fog is angry, and it might try to take more of us." As they returned to their trucks, Chester noticed something that chilled him more than anything else that night. In the fog bank, clearly visible, were taillights. Dozens of them, all pulsing in that hypnotic rhythm. But now he recognized the pattern. It was Morse code, repeating the same message over and over. You can never leave the fog. Always wins. The fog had learned to communicate more directly. It was evolving, becoming more intelligent, more purposeful. And it had a message specifically for the fog watchers. Resistance was futile, but Chester refused to accept that. As he drove away with the convoy of fog watchers, he made a decision. They would document everything, every encounter, every escape, every loss. They would create a comprehensive guide to surviving the fog, distribute it to every truck stop, every driving school, every transportation company on the West Coast. The fog might be eternal, might be hungry, might be evolving, but so were they. And as long as there were drivers on the roads, there would be those who watched for the fog, warned about its dangers, and fought to keep their fellow truckers safe. Chester looked in his mirror one last time as they left the area. The fog bank remained, waiting, patient. But now he could see faces in it. Agnes still waving, Marcus watching sadly, and now David, newest addition to the eternal highway. "We'll find a way to free you all," Chester said quietly. "Someday, somehow, we'll find a way to break the fog's hold." Whether that was a promise he could keep, only time would tell. But Chester knew that his encounter with the fog had changed him forever. He was no longer just a truck driver hauling seafood up and down the coast. He was a guardian, a watcher, a warrior in a battle most people didn't even know existed. The road stretched on ahead, dark and full of hidden dangers. But Chester drove on, his lights cutting through the darkness, his CB radio crackling with the voices of other watchers, all of them united in their determination to protect those who traveled the haunted highways of the West Coast. And somewhere behind them the fog waited, patient and hungry, for the next driver to enter its gray embrace. Virgil had been an owner-operator for 8 years, and in that time, he'd turned his truck into a fortress. Every lock was top of the line. Every security measure was redundant, and he'd installed enough cameras to rival a casino's surveillance system. Some drivers called him paranoid, but Virgil had worked too hard to buy his 2019 Kenworth W900 to let some lot lizard or thief take advantage of him. The truck wasn't just his livelihood. It was his home, his office, and the culmination of 20 years of saving and sacrifice. That's why when things started going wrong, Virgil noticed immediately. It began on a Monday morning in late October at the Pacific Pride truck stop just off I-5 in southern Oregon. Virgil had parked there Sunday night after completing a run from Seattle to Medford, hauling agricultural equipment. The lot was well lit, had security patrols, and was known as one of the safer stops on the route. Virgil had done his usual walk-around before turning in, checking every lock, every seal, every potential point of entry. Everything was secure. But when he woke up Monday morning and did his pre-trip inspection, he found the first sign of tampering. Someone had loosened the lug nuts on his front driver's side wheel. Not removed them, just loosened them enough that they would have worked themselves free after a few miles of driving, potentially causing a catastrophic wheel separation at highway speed. If Virgil hadn't been meticulous about his inspections, he would have missed it. He tightened the lug nuts, then checked every other wheel. All secure. Only that one wheel had been tampered with, suggesting this wasn't random vandalism but targeted sabotage. Virgil reviewed his security camera footage from the night, but the angle on that particular wheel was partially blocked by another truck that had parked beside him. All he could see was a shadow moving near his truck around 3 a.m. Virgil reported the incident to truck stop security, but they hadn't seen anything unusual. Their cameras didn't cover that section of the lot clearly. The security guard, an elderly man named Pete, suggested it might have been someone looking to cause an accident and then offer roadside assistance at inflated prices, a scam that had been reported at other stops. "But why target me specifically?" Virgil asked. Pete shrugged. "Nice truck like yours? Maybe someone's jealous, or maybe you cut someone off without realizing it and they're holding a grudge." Virgil couldn't think of any incidents that would provoke this kind of retaliation, but he made a note in his logbook and continued his day. He had a load of lumber to pick up in Grants Pass and deliver to Sacramento. Business as usual. The second incident occurred 3 days later at a truck stop in Red Bluff, California. This time, Virgil had positioned his truck strategically, backed against a fence, good sight lines, all cameras operational. He even stayed awake until 2 a.m., watching for any suspicious activity. When he finally went to sleep, he set proximity alarms that would alert him if anyone came within 5 feet of his truck. The alarms never went off. But in the morning, Virgil discovered that someone had put sugar in his fuel tank. Not a lot, just enough to potentially cause engine problems down the road. He only discovered it because he'd developed a habit of checking his fuel cap every morning, and this time he noticed granular residue around the opening. Virgil had to have his tanks drained and cleaned, losing a full day of work and spending nearly $2,000 on the service. The mechanic who did the work, a young guy named Tyler, told him this was the third case of fuel tampering he'd seen that month. "Same MO each time," Tyler said. "Just enough sugar to cause problems, but not enough to be immediately obvious. It's like someone's trying to cause breakdowns rather than immediate damage." "The other drivers, were they owner-operators with newer trucks?" Virgil asked. Tyler thought about it. "Yeah, actually, both of them. One had a 2020 Freightliner, the other a 2018 Peterbilt. Both customized, both really well maintained. Why?" "Someone's targeting successful owner-operators," Virgil said. "Someone with a grudge against drivers who are doing well." The third incident was the one that truly unnerved Virgil. He'd been hyper-vigilant for a week, parking only at major chain truck stops with excellent security, never leaving his truck unattended, checking and rechecking everything. He'd even started sleeping in shifts, waking every 2 hours to do a walk-around. It was a Thursday night at the Flying J in Redding, California. Virgil had just picked up a load of electronics in Portland, bound for Los Angeles, a high-value shipment that required extra security precautions anyway. He'd been awake until 3 a.m., had done his walk-around, and everything was perfect. He set his alarm for 5 a.m., planning another inspection before he started driving. But when he woke up, something felt wrong. Nothing he could put his finger on, just a sense that something was off. He did his walk-around and found nothing amiss. Checked his cameras, no unusual activity. Examined his fuel tank, his tires, his fifth wheel, his brake lines. Everything was normal. It wasn't until he started his engine that he realized what had been done. Someone had reprogrammed his truck's ECM, the engine control module that governed everything from fuel injection to emission controls. The engine started normally, but the settings had been altered to cause gradual damage. The fuel mixture was too rich, the timing was off, and the emission controls were disabled. If Virgil had driven with these settings, his engine would have suffered severe damage within a few hundred miles. The truly disturbing part was that accessing the ECM required specialized equipment and knowledge. This wasn't something a casual vandal could do. This was professional-level sabotage. Virgil called the police this time. Officer Rachel Martinez responded, taking his report seriously once she understood the sophistication of the tampering. "Mr. Reeves," she said, using Virgil's last name. "This level of targeting suggests someone with inside knowledge of trucking, possibly someone in the industry. Can you think of anyone who might have a grudge against you? Former employees, business rivals, anyone?" Virgil had been an owner-operator his entire 8 years, never had employees. His business relationships were all positive as far as he knew. He couldn't think of anyone who would do this. "What about other drivers experiencing similar problems?" Virgil asked. Officer Martinez checked her tablet. "There have been several reports of truck tampering in the past month, but nothing this sophisticated. Mostly it's been fuel contamination, tire damage, that sort of thing." "All owner-operators?" She checked again. "Actually, yes. All owner-operators with trucks less than 5 years old. That's an interesting pattern." Martinez promised to investigate further, but Virgil knew that without catching someone in the act, there wasn't much law enforcement could do. He needed to take matters into his own hands. Virgil had the ECM reset at a dealership, costing him another day and another $1,000. But while he was there, he had them install additional security measures, hidden cameras, motion sensors, even a GPS tracker that would alert him if his truck moved without him in it. He also started reaching out to other owner-operators, creating an informal network to share information about tampering incidents. What he learned was troubling. Over the past 2 months, at least 15 owner-operators had experienced some form of sabotage. The methods varied. contaminated fuel, loosened components, damaged airlines, tampered electronics, but the pattern was consistent. All were successful owner-operators with newer, well-maintained equipment. One driver, a woman named Carol from Spokane, had a theory. "It's someone who resents our success," she said during a conference call Virgil organized. "Someone who thinks we don't deserve what we have. Maybe a driver who lost their truck, went bankrupt, and blames owners like us for their failure." It was plausible, but it didn't narrow down the suspect pool much. The trucking industry was full of people who'd failed for various reasons, many of them bitter about it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Virgil was at the Petro truck stop in Bakersfield, California, having just completed his inspection and found no tampering for 3 days straight. He was starting to hope the saboteur had moved on when an elderly woman approached his truck. She was wearing a truck stop employee uniform with the name Ethel on her badge, and she looked nervous. "You're Virgil Reeves?" she asked. "That's right. Can I help you?" Ethel looked around nervously, then stepped closer. "I need to tell you something, but you didn't hear it from me, understand?" Virgil nodded, his attention fully focused. "There's a man been asking about you, about your truck, your routes, when you usually stop here. He says he's a friend of yours, but something about him doesn't sit right with me. Can you describe him? White fellow, maybe 45, 50, average height, thin build, always wears a baseball cap and sunglasses, even at night. Drives an old white van, no windows in the back. Claims his name is Clarence, but he paid for fuel with a credit card once, and I saw the name was different." "What name was on the card?" "Mitchell Barnes. I remembered because my maiden name was Barnes." Virgil felt his blood chill. Mitchell Barnes was a name he knew. 5 years ago, when Virgil was still relatively new to being an owner-operator, he'd won a contract that Barnes had also bid on, a lucrative dedicated route hauling auto parts. Barnes had been an owner-operator too, but his equipment was older, his reputation spottier. Losing that contract had apparently been the final straw for Barnes's struggling business. He'd lost his truck 6 months later, declared bankruptcy, and disappeared from the trucking scene. "When was the last time you saw him?" Virgil asked Ethel. "This morning, actually. He was in the shop buying cable ties and electrical tape. Paid cash this time." Cable ties and electrical tape. Perfect for securing something to the underside of a truck, like a tracking device or a bomb. Virgil thanked Ethel and immediately went back to his truck for a thorough inspection. Using a mirror on a telescoping pole, he examined every inch of the undercarriage. It took him 45 minutes, but he finally found it. A small black box attached to his fuel tank with heavy-duty magnets. It was a GPS tracker, but not a commercial model. This one had been modified with additional components that Virgil didn't recognize. He was about to remove it when instinct made him stop. If Barnes was tracking him, removing the device would alert him that Virgil was on to him. Better to leave it in place and use it to his advantage. Virgil took photos of the device, then climbed back into his cab and started making calls. First to Officer Martinez, updating her on the Barnes lead. Then to his insurance company, documenting the ongoing harassment. Finally, to his network of owner-operators, warning them about Mitchell Barnes and asking them to watch for an old white van. The response was immediate. 3 other drivers reported seeing a van matching that description at truck stops where tampering had occurred. One driver, Marcus Washington from Fresno, had actually had a conversation with the van's driver. "He approached me at the fuel island," Marcus said. "Started talking about how tough it is for independent drivers these days, how the big companies and successful owner-operators are squeezing out the little guys. I thought he was just another bitter washout, but now that you mention it, he was asking a lot of questions about my truck, my routes." "Did he seem interested when you told him?" Virgil asked. "Here's the thing. I lied to him. Something about him rubbed me wrong, so I told him I was driving for a company, not my own truck. He lost interest immediately and walked away. That confirmed it. Barnes was specifically targeting successful owner-operators. Virgil developed a plan. If Barnes was tracking him, Virgil would lead him into a trap. He put the word out through his network, then made a very public post on a trucking forum about his next route, a high-value load of electronics from San Jose to Phoenix, with an overnight stop at a specific truck stop in Bakersfield. He even mentioned the approximate time he'd be arriving. It was bait, and Barnes took it. Virgil arrived at the Bakersfield truck stop at 10 p.m., parking in a spot he'd specifically chosen, visible from multiple angles, well lit, and surrounded by other trucks whose drivers were part of Virgil's network. Everyone was watching, waiting. At 2:30 a.m., the white van appeared. It parked 3 rows away, and a figure emerged. Baseball cap, sunglasses despite the darkness, thin build. Barnes moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the lot's layout and the blind spots in the security camera coverage. He approached Virgil's truck from the passenger side carrying a small bag, but as Barnes reached for something under the truck, lights suddenly blazed from every direction. 5 other drivers had been waiting, and they all turned on their spotlights simultaneously, catching Barnes in the act. He had a cordless drill in one hand and what looked like a brake line cutting tool in the other. "Mitchell Barnes!" Virgil called out from his cab, his voice amplified by his truck's PA system. "Step away from the truck. The police are on their way." Barnes froze, then tried to run, but the other drivers had positioned themselves strategically. Wherever Barnes turned, there was another truck blocking his escape route. He was trapped in a circle of light and steel. Officer Martinez arrived within minutes, along with backup. Barnes was arrested on multiple charges of vandalism, attempted destruction of property, and stalking. When they searched his van, they found detailed records of his activities, photos of dozens of trucks, schedules he'd compiled from social media and forum posts, and equipment for various types of sabotage. But the most disturbing discovery was a manifesto Barnes had written. In it, he blamed successful owner-operators for his failure, claiming they'd conspired to force him out of business. He'd convinced himself that by sabotaging their equipment, he was leveling the playing field and fighting back against the elite. The reality, as Virgil learned during the investigation, was that Barnes had failed due to his own poor decisions, not maintaining his equipment, missing deliveries, alienating customers. But rather than accept responsibility, he'd constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory with successful owner-operators as the villains. At Barnes's apartment, police found more evidence of his obsession. Walls covered with photos of trucks and drivers, including several of Virgil. Detailed plans for sabotage operations. A list of 50 owner-operators he planned to target, with Virgil at the top. "You were his primary focus," Officer Martinez told Virgil later. "In his mind, you represented everything he thought had been stolen from him. Your success was proof of his failure." The revelation that he'd been the object of such intense, irrational hatred shook Virgil more than he cared to admit. He'd always prided himself on being a good member of the trucking community, helping other drivers when he could, maintaining professional relationships. The idea that his success alone had made him a target was deeply unsettling. Barnes was charged with multiple felonies and ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison. But even with him behind bars, Virgil found it hard to shake the paranoia his campaign of sabotage had instilled. Every unexpected sound near his truck made him tense. Every stranger who looked at his rig too long became a potential threat. The other drivers who'd been targeted formed a support group of sorts, meeting at truck stops to share their experiences and coping strategies. They discovered that many of them had been struggling with similar anxiety and hypervigilance. "He took something from us," Carol said during one gathering. "Not just money or time, but our sense of security. The feeling that our trucks were safe spaces." Virgil knew she was right. His truck, once his sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. He'd added even more security measures, alarms, cameras, tracking devices, but they felt like bandages on a wound that wouldn't heal. 3 months after Barnes's arrest, Virgil was at a truck stop in Nevada when he encountered someone who would change his perspective on the entire ordeal. The man introduced himself as Dr. James Patterson, a psychologist who specialized in treating truckers dealing with trauma and stress. He'd heard about the Barnes case and had been reaching out to affected drivers. "What you experienced wasn't just property crime," Dr. Patterson explained over coffee. "It was psychological warfare. Barnes deliberately tried to make you feel unsafe in your professional environment. That's a form of terrorism, really." "I never thought of it that way," Virgil admitted. "The random nature of the attacks, the escalation, the sophistication, it was all designed to keep you off balance, never knowing when or how the next attack would come. That creates a state of chronic stress that can have serious psychological effects." Virgil found himself opening up to Dr. Patterson about the changes he'd noticed in himself. The difficulty sleeping, the constant checking and rechecking of his equipment, the suspicion of other drivers that had never been there before. "These are normal responses to what you've been through," Dr. Patterson assured him. "But they don't have to be permanent. With time and the right strategies, you can reclaim your sense of security." Over the next few months, Virgil worked with Dr. Patterson, learning techniques to manage his anxiety and gradually rebuild his confidence. He also became an advocate for other drivers dealing with similar issues, sharing his story at trucking conferences and online forums. The Barnes case, as it came to be known in trucking circles, led to increased awareness of the vulnerability owner-operators faced. Truck stops improved their security measures. Law enforcement began taking tampering reports more seriously. Insurance companies offered better coverage for sabotage-related losses. But for Virgil, the most important change was internal. He learned to balance vigilance with peace of mind, to be aware of potential threats without being consumed by them. His truck became his sanctuary again, though now it was a sanctuary with really good locks and cameras. One evening, about a year after Barnes's arrest, Virgil was at the same Bakersfield truck stop where the confrontation had occurred. He was parked in almost the same spot, though this time by coincidence rather than design. As he did his evening walk-around, he noticed another owner-operator, a young guy with a brand-new Peterbilt, doing his own inspection. The younger driver looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder, examining every component with excessive thoroughness. Virgil recognized the behavior. It was exactly how he'd acted after discovering Barnes's sabotage. "First truck?" Virgil asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. "Yeah," the young driver admitted. "Just got it last month. Heard about all the tampering that's been happening. Making me paranoid." Virgil smiled sympathetically. "Vigilance is good. Paranoia will eat you alive. Want me to show you some practical security measures that actually work?" For the next hour, Virgil shared his hard-won knowledge with the younger driver. Not just about locks and cameras, but about maintaining perspective, building community with other drivers, and not letting fear control your life on the road. "The thing is," Virgil concluded, "there will always be Mitchell Barnes types out there. People who resent success, who blame others for their failures. But they're the exception, not the rule. Most folks out here are just trying to make a living, same as us." The younger driver thanked him and returned to his truck, visibly more relaxed. Virgil watched him go, remembering his own fears and how far he'd come in dealing with them. 6 months later, Virgil thought he'd put the Barnes incident behind him. His anxiety had decreased, his security measures had become routine rather than obsessive, and he'd even started enjoying the road again. That's when the letters started arriving. The first one was waiting for him at his home address in Modesto when he returned from a week-long run. It was handwritten on plain paper, no return address. "Virgil, you think you won. You think putting Mitchell away solved your problems. But Mitchell was just one of us. We're everywhere, watching, waiting. Every successful owner-operator who thinks they're better than the rest of us is on our list. Enjoy your success while it lasts. A friend. Virgil immediately took the letter to the police, but they couldn't do much with it. No specific threats, no identifying information could have been from anyone. Officer Martinez, who'd handled the Barnes case, suggested it might be a copycat or someone inspired by Barnes's actions. "We'll increase patrols in your area," she promised, but without more to go on. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, this time at a truck stop in Oregon, handed to him by the desk clerk who said someone had dropped it off for him. "Virgil, saw you helping that young driver last week. Very noble. Did you tell him about us? Did you warn him that success paints a target on your back? Mitchell understood something you don't. The industry doesn't have room for everyone to succeed. Someone has to fail for others to thrive. You thrived on Mitchell's failure. Now others will thrive on yours. A friend." This letter was more unsettling because it referenced a specific incident. Someone had been watching him, following him. Virgil started varying his routes again, checking for surveillance, but found nothing. The third letter changed everything. It included a photograph. Virgil at a truck stop in Fresno, talking to another driver. The photo had been taken from distance with a telephoto lens, but the detail was clear. On the back was written, "We can reach you anywhere." Virgil called an emergency meeting of his owner-operator network. 8 drivers met at a truck stop in Sacramento, all of them concerned about this new threat. "I've gotten letters too," Carol admitted. 3 of them. No photos, but similar message. "We're being watched. We're targets." Marcus Washington had received 2 letters. Another driver, Tom, had received 4. All successful owner-operators, all being told they were on some kind of list. "This isn't one person," Tom said. "The handwriting on my letters is different each time. We're dealing with a group." They decided to hire a private investigator, pooling their resources to afford a good one. The PI, a former FBI agent named Sarah Coleman, took the case seriously. "Organized harassment of this type often escalates," she warned. "We need to identify the group before they move from letters to action." Sarah's investigation revealed something disturbing. In online forums dedicated to trucking, there were threads discussing the Barnes case with disturbing sympathy for his actions. Some posters claimed Barnes was a hero who stood up to the owner-operator elite. A few suggested continuing his work. One username kept appearing in these discussions: Highway Justice. This poster seemed to be coordinating something, asking for volunteers in different regions, sharing information about identifying successful owner-operators. Sarah managed to trace the IP address to a truck stop in Bakersfield, the same one where Barnes had been arrested. She coordinated with local law enforcement and cybercrime units to set up surveillance. What they discovered was more organized than anyone had expected. The group called itself the Displaced Drivers Alliance. Failed owner-operators, drivers who'd lost their CDLs, and others who blamed successful truckers for their problems. They met monthly at different truck stops, sharing information about targets, discussing tactics, and reinforcing each other's grievances. The leader was Clarence Hoffman, though he often used aliases. He was a former owner-operator who'd lost everything in a bankruptcy 5 years earlier, around the same time as Mitchell Barnes. Unlike Barnes, who'd acted alone, Clarence had decided to build a movement. Law enforcement moved in during one of their meetings, arresting 7 members, including Clarence. The evidence seized included detailed files on over 100 successful owner-operators, plans for coordinated sabotage campaigns, and even discussions about more violent actions. Clarence's arrest should have been the end of it, but it had an unexpected consequence. The media picked up the story, and suddenly the war between truckers became national news. The coverage was sensationalized, making it seem like the entire trucking industry was divided into 2 camps: successful owner-operators versus displaced drivers. Virgil found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as one of the primary targets of both Barnes and the DDA. Reporters wanted interviews, documentary makers wanted his story, and social media was full of people taking sides in a conflict that most truckers didn't even know existed. "This isn't who we are," Virgil told one reporter. "The vast majority of truckers support each other, regardless of whether we're owner-operators, company drivers, or anything in between. These extremists don't represent us." But the damage was done. The industry's reputation was tarnished, and divisions that had barely existed were now being highlighted and exacerbated. Some owner-operators became more insular, suspicious of other drivers. Some company drivers felt unfairly lumped in with the extremists. Virgil decided something needed to be done to heal these manufactured divisions. He worked with Carol, Marcus, Tom, and others to organize what they called the United Truckers Initiative, a series of events bringing together drivers of all types to share experiences, offer mutual support, and demonstrate that the industry was united despite the actions of a few bad actors. The first event was held at the Bakersfield truck stop where Barnes had been arrested, a deliberate choice to reclaim the space from its negative associations. Over 200 drivers attended, including company drivers, owner-operators, retired truckers, and even some drivers who'd lost their trucks but hadn't turned to extremism. One of the speakers was a man named Robert, who'd lost his truck around the same time as Barnes and Clarence. But instead of blaming others, he'd taken responsibility, gotten treatment for the gambling addiction that had caused his financial problems, and was now driving for a company while rebuilding his credit. "I could have been Mitchell Barnes," Robert admitted to the crowd. "I was angry, bitter, looking for someone to blame. But then I realized the only person responsible for my failure was me, and the only person who could fix it was me." His words resonated with many in attendance, including some who'd been sympathetic to Barnes and the DDA's message. The event was a success, leading to similar gatherings across the West Coast. But even as the community healing began, Virgil couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. The paranoia that Barnes had instilled, that the DDA had reinforced, lingered like a shadow. One night, parked at a truck stop in Portland, Virgil was doing his usual walk around when he noticed someone watching him from across the lot. It was a woman, middle-aged, standing beside an old pickup truck. She seemed to be debating whether to approach him. Finally, she walked over. "You're Virgil Reeves?" Virgil tensed, ready for another confrontation. "That's right. I'm Mitchell Barnes' sister, Catherine." Virgil's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, ready to call for help. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Catherine said quickly. I wanted to apologize for what Mitchell did to you, to the others. I knew he was struggling, but I had no idea how far he'd fallen into his delusions." Virgil relaxed slightly but remained cautious. "It's not your fault. Maybe not directly, but I saw the signs and didn't act. His obsession with successful owner-operators, his conspiracy theories, his anger. I should have gotten him help." They talked for nearly an hour. Catherine explained how Mitchell had always struggled with failure, always blamed others for his problems. The trucking business had been his last attempt at success, and when it failed, something in him had broken. "Prison has actually helped him," she said. "He's getting therapy, medication for his paranoia. He's beginning to understand that what he did was wrong." "That's good to hear," Virgil said and meant it. Catherine pulled out an envelope. "He wrote you a letter, an apology. He wanted me to give it to you, but I understand if you don't want to read it." Virgil took the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But having it, knowing that Barnes had reached a point where he could apologize, felt like a kind of closure. The letter from Mitchell Barnes sat unopened in Virgil's truck for 3 weeks. He'd look at it sometimes during long drives, wondering what words could possibly undo the months of terror Barnes had inflicted. Finally, on a quiet evening at a rest area overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Virgil opened it. "Virgil, I don't expect forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. I targeted you and others because it was easier than admitting I failed because of my own choices. You became the symbol of everything I thought I deserved but didn't get. The truth is, you succeeded because you worked harder, made better decisions, and took care of your equipment and relationships. I failed because I didn't. I see that now. I'm sorry for the fear I caused you. I'm sorry for trying to destroy what you built. I'm getting help now, learning to take responsibility for my life. I hope someday you can feel safe again. Mitchell Barnes. Virgil read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his logbook. He didn't forgive Barnes. That would take more time, if it ever came at all. But the letter represented something important: accountability. Barnes had finally owned his actions. 2 days later, Virgil got a call from Sarah Coleman, the private investigator. "Virgil, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice tense. "We've been monitoring online chatter since the DDA arrests. There's someone new, someone calling themselves the Mechanic. They're claiming the DDA and Barnes were amateurs, that they're going to show how it's really done." "More threats?" Virgil asked, exhausted by the idea of another round of paranoia. "Not just threats. They've posted technical diagrams showing how to sabotage specific truck models, including yours. They know things about truck mechanics that suggest insider knowledge, possibly a former mechanic or engineer." Virgil felt the familiar cold dread returning. "What do the police say?" "They're investigating, but this person is using advanced encryption, routing through multiple servers. They're technically sophisticated in a way Barnes and the DDA weren't." Over the next week, reports started coming in from across the West Coast. Owner-operators were finding sophisticated sabotage, not the crude tampering Barnes had done, but subtle modifications that would cause failures at specific speeds or under specific conditions. One driver in Seattle discovered his brake system had been modified to fail if he exceeded 65 mph. Another in San Diego found his steering had been adjusted to gradually loosen over time. The modifications required deep knowledge of truck systems and specialized tools. This wasn't angry vandalism, it was engineered destruction. Virgil increased his security again, but he knew that against someone with this level of expertise, cameras and locks might not be enough. He started having his truck inspected by certified mechanics before every trip, adding thousands to his operating costs. Then Ethel, the truck stop employee who'd first warned him about Barnes, called him with new information. "There's been a man asking about you again," she said. "Different from Barnes. This one's older, maybe 60, walks with a limp, claims to be a retired mechanic doing a documentary about truck safety. But Virgil, he was asking specifically about your truck's maintenance schedule, when you get it serviced, where. Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not, but he might have gotten information from others. He seemed to know a lot already." Virgil shared this information with his network and Sarah Coleman. The description didn't match anyone in the DDA files, suggesting this was indeed someone new. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Mechanic in Oakland, a veteran named Luis, recognized the description. "That sounds like Howard Gentry," Luis said. "Used to be one of the best diesel mechanics on the West Coast. Had his own shop, trained dozens of mechanics. But he lost everything about 10 years ago in a lawsuit." "What kind of lawsuit?" Sarah Coleman asked. "A driver claimed Howard's negligent maintenance caused an accident. The driver was an owner-operator who'd been bringing his truck to Howard for years. After the accident, he sued Howard for everything. Howard lost his shop, his reputation, everything." Sarah dug into the records and found the case. The driver who'd sued Howard Gentry was Richard Vance, a successful owner-operator who'd walked away from the accident with minor injuries, but had seen an opportunity for a payday. The lawsuit had been questionable at best. The accident was more likely due to driver error than maintenance issues. But Howard hadn't been able to afford good lawyers. "Where's Richard Vance now?" Virgil asked. Sarah's expression darkened. He died 3 months ago. His truck suffered a catastrophic brake failure on Donner Pass. The investigation ruled it an accident, but given what we know now, the implication was chilling. Howard Gentry had possibly murdered the man who destroyed his life, and now he was targeting other successful owner-operators, perhaps seeing them all as variations of Richard Vance. Law enforcement launched a manhunt for Howard Gentry, but he'd gone underground. The online persona of the mechanic went silent. For 2 weeks, there were no new incidents, no sightings, nothing. Then Virgil got a call that changed everything. It was 2 a.m., and he was asleep in his bunk at a truck stop in Reading. The phone rang, not his regular phone, but the emergency phone he'd gotten specifically for the security company that monitored his truck. "Mr. Reeves, this is Secure Ride Monitoring. Your truck's alarm has been triggered, but your cameras aren't showing anyone near the vehicle." Virgil was instantly awake. He looked out his windows, nothing visible in the darkness beyond the truck stop's lights. "Are the cameras malfunctioning?" he asked. "No, sir. They're operational, but whoever triggered the alarm isn't visible on any of them." Virgil realized what that meant. Someone who knew exactly where his cameras were positioned. Someone who could navigate the blind spots. Someone who'd studied his security system. He grabbed his flashlight and his phone, ready to call 911, but then he heard a voice from directly beneath his truck. "Don't call the police, Virgil. Not yet. We need to talk." It was an older man's voice, tired and strained. Howard Gentry. "You're the one who's been sabotaging trucks," Virgil said, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. "I was, but I'm done with that now. I didn't come here to hurt you, Virgil. I came to warn you." "Warn me about what?" "About the real threat. The one that's been using me, Barnes, the DDA, all of us. We thought we were acting on our own anger, our own grievances, but someone's been pulling the strings, turning drivers against each other for their own purposes." Virgil was skeptical but curious. "Come out where I can see you." Howard crawled out from under the truck, and Virgil saw a broken man, thin, haggard, with the haunted look of someone who'd realized they'd been used. He stood with his hands visible, no weapons, no tools. "Start talking," Virgil said. Howard explained that after losing his shop, he'd been contacted by someone offering him work. Not legitimate work, but sabotage for hire. At first he'd refused, but as his situation got more desperate, he'd accepted. "They never told me their name, only communicated through encrypted messages. They provided lists of targets, all successful owner-operators. They knew about my history with Richard Vance, used it to manipulate me, convince me that all successful owners were like him." "Who are they?" "I don't know for certain, but I've pieced together some things. The timing of the targets, the specific trucks chosen, it's all connected to shipping routes and cargo. Someone's using the sabotage to disrupt specific supply chains, probably for economic advantage." Virgil's mind raced. This wasn't about trucker rivalries or personal grievances. This was corporate sabotage, using angry and desperate individuals as unwitting tools. "They provided me with information about security systems, maintenance schedules, everything I needed. That's how I knew about your cameras, your alarms. They're watching all of us, Virgil. Not just the owner-operators, but people like me and Barnes, too. They know exactly which buttons to push to turn us into weapons." "Why should I believe you?" Howard pulled out a phone, a burner from the look of it. "Because I recorded my last conversation with them. They wanted me to do something bigger, something that would kill multiple drivers. I refused, and they threatened me. That's when I realized I was just a tool to them." He played the recording. The voice was disguised, electronic, but the content was clear. Instructions for causing a massive pileup on I-5 by sabotaging multiple trucks to fail simultaneously at a specific location. The caller mentioned insurance payouts, stock prices, and market disruptions. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit mass murder," Virgil said. "We need to take this to the FBI." "I know. That's why I came to you. You're the one who exposed Barnes, who helped bring down the DDA. You have credibility. They'll believe you." Virgil called Sarah Coleman first, then the FBI. Within hours, Howard was in custody, cooperating fully with federal investigators. The recording and Howard's testimony opened up a massive investigation into corporate sabotage and attempted murder. The investigation revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. A consortium of shipping companies had been orchestrating the sabotage to eliminate independent owner-operators and create disruptions they could exploit for profit. They'd identified vulnerable individuals like Barnes, the DDA members, and Howard, and manipulated them into doing their dirty work. The FBI raids that followed arrested 17 corporate executives and logistics managers across 3 states. The evidence seized included detailed psychological profiles of potential saboteurs, plans for supply chain disruptions, and financial records showing massive profits from the manufactured chaos. Howard Gentry was sentenced to 15 years but got reduced time for cooperation. Mitchell Barnes, learning that he'd been manipulated, provided additional testimony from prison. The DDA members, realizing they'd been pawns in someone else's game, cooperated fully with investigators. The trucking industry reeled from the revelations. The idea that corporate interests had deliberately turned drivers against each other for profit was a betrayal that cut deep. But it also had an unexpected positive effect. It united drivers in a way nothing else could have. The United Truckers Initiative that Virgil had helped start grew into a national movement. Owner-operators and company drivers stood together against corporate manipulation. New regulations were passed to protect independent drivers from predatory practices. Insurance companies were required to investigate claims more thoroughly to prevent sabotage from being hidden as accidents. Virgil found himself testifying before Congress about his experiences. He spoke about the fear, the paranoia, the division that had been deliberately created within the trucking community. "They wanted us to destroy each other," he told the committee, "so they could profit from the chaos. They took advantage of real grievances, real pain, and weaponized it. We can't let that happen again." In the aftermath of what became known as the Highway Conspiracy, Virgil noticed a change in the trucking community. Drivers were more supportive of each other, more aware of how outside forces might try to divide them. The CB chatter included more check-ins, more offers of help, more solidarity. One evening, a year after the conspiracy was exposed, Virgil was at the Bakersfield truck stop where so much had happened. He was doing his usual walk-around when he noticed a young driver struggling with a tire change. Without hesitation, Virgil went to help. As they worked together, the young driver mentioned he was just starting out as an owner-operator, nervous about all the challenges ahead. "The road's got plenty of challenges," Virgil told him, "but the biggest threat isn't out there on the highway. It's the people who want to see us fail, who profit from our division. Stay connected with other drivers, support each other. Don't let anyone turn you against your fellow truckers." The young driver nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Is it true what they say? That you were the one who exposed the whole conspiracy?" "I was just one part of it," Virgil said. "It took all of us, the victims, the investigators, even the people who'd been manipulated into participating. It took a community." As Virgil returned to his truck, he reflected on how much had changed. His Kenworth still had all its security measures, but they felt less like armor against a hostile world and more like reasonable precautions. The paranoia that had once consumed him had transformed into vigilance tempered with community support. He climbed into his cab, did his final checks, and started the engine. The road stretched ahead, dark and full of possibilities, but Virgil no longer faced it alone. He was part of a community that had been tested by manipulation and division, but had emerged stronger and more united. The CB crackled to life with the usual chatter. drivers sharing information about weather, traffic, and good places to eat. But now there was something else in those conversations, an undercurrent of solidarity that hadn't been there before. "This is Virgil, heading south on I-5, he said into the mic. "Everyone drive safe out there. And remember, we're all in this together." The responses came back immediately. Dozens of drivers acknowledging his message, wishing him safe travels. The conspiracy had tried to turn them against each other, but instead, it had reminded them of a fundamental truth. On the dark highways of America, truckers had to look out for each other, because sometimes no one else would. As he drove into the night, Virgil thought about Mitchell Barnes in prison, getting therapy and possibly finding redemption. He thought about Howard Gentry, paying for his crimes but having found the courage to expose the larger conspiracy. He thought about all the drivers who'd been targeted, manipulated, and hurt, but who'd refused to let it break them. The road had tested them all in different ways. Some had failed those tests, giving in to anger, resentment, and manipulation. But in the end, the truth had prevailed, and the community had survived. Virgil's lights cut through the darkness as he headed south, one truck among thousands keeping America moving. Behind him, the lights of other trucks followed, and ahead, more lights led the way. They were all connected, all part of the same flowing river of commerce and community. The saboteurs' game had been exposed and defeated. The road belonged to the drivers again. Harold had been driving the night shift routes along Highway 99 through California's Central Valley for 11 years, and he'd developed a reputation as the driver who'd take the loads nobody else wanted. The 2 a.m. pickups, the unmarked warehouses, the cargo that came with pages of non-disclosure agreements. If the money was right and the paperwork was legal, Harold would haul it. That flexibility had made him successful, but it had also put him in situations that most drivers deliberately avoided. It was a Wednesday night in early January when Harold got the call that would change everything. He was deadheading back from Los Angeles, his trailer empty after delivering produce to the wholesale markets, when his dispatcher contacted him with an unusual request. "Harold, I've got a special load if you're interested," Tom said, his voice carrying that tone that meant this wasn't a normal assignment. "Triple rate, cash bonus on completion, but there are some unique requirements." Harold pulled into a rest area near Bakersfield to discuss the details. In his experience, triple rate meant either dangerous cargo or suspicious circumstances, sometimes both. "What's the catch?" Harold asked. "Pickup is at 3 a.m. sharp from a facility in Fresno. No early, no late. Exactly 3 a.m. You'll be hauling medical equipment to a research center in Eureka. The cargo is temperature sensitive and requires constant monitoring. And Harold, you can't stop anywhere except at pre-approved locations. They'll give you a list." "Medical equipment doesn't usually pay triple rate," Harold observed. "This is specialized stuff, experimental. The client is very particular about handling and security. You interested?" Harold thought about his mortgage payment, his daughter's college tuition, the new transmission his truck needed. Triple rate would cover all of that and more. "Send me the details," Harold said. The pickup location was in an industrial area on the outskirts of Fresno, a cluster of warehouses that Harold had passed many times but never paid attention to. As he approached at 2:45 a.m., he noticed there were no signs, no company names, just building numbers. Building 47 was his destination. The security at the gate was more intense than Harold expected. 2 guards, both armed, checked his paperwork multiple times, made phone calls, and inspected his trailer with mirrors and dogs before finally waving him through. The loading dock was lit like a football stadium, every shadow eliminated by harsh white lights. A woman in a lab coat was waiting for him. She was middle-aged, professional, but there was something nervous about her demeanor. Her badge identified her as Dr. Ruth Morgan, but she didn't offer her hand or any pleasantries. "Mr. Harold Krensky?" she asked, consulting a tablet. That's right. Your trailer has been pre-cooled to the correct temperature? Holding steady at 35 degrees Fahrenheit, just like requested. Good. The loading will take approximately 30 minutes. You are not to leave your cab during this time. You are not to observe the loading process. Is that understood? Harold had hauled sensitive cargo before, but this level of secrecy was unusual. Understood. He climbed back into his cab and waited, watching his mirrors as workers in full hazmat suits wheeled containers from the warehouse to his trailer. The containers were white, about the size of large coolers, with biohazard symbols and electronic displays showing temperature readings. Harold counted 12 containers total. Dr. Morgan returned with a thick folder of paperwork. Mr. Krensky, this contains your route, your approved stopping points, and emergency protocols. Do not deviate from the route under any circumstances. If you experience mechanical problems, call this number immediately. She handed him a satellite phone. Do not use your personal phone or CB radio to discuss this cargo. What exactly am I hauling? Harold asked. Medical equipment, as your dispatcher told you. The specifics are classified under medical research confidentiality agreements. You've signed the NDAs, correct? Harold nodded, though he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Your first approved stop is a rest area 127 miles north. You have a 4-hour window to reach it. Someone will meet you there to check the cargo stability. After that, you have one more approved stop before Eureka. The entire journey should take no more than 8 hours. As Harold pulled out of the facility, he noticed vehicles following him, a black SUV that maintained a steady distance behind his trailer. His escort, apparently. Whatever he was hauling, someone thought it was valuable enough or dangerous enough to require armed guards. The first hour of driving was uneventful. Highway 99 North was empty except for a few other trucks and the occasional car. The SUV stayed exactly 300 feet behind him, never varying its distance. Harold found himself checking his mirrors obsessively, looking for any sign of what made this cargo so special. At 4:17 a.m., something changed. Harold heard a sound from his trailer, a rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on the walls from inside. He checked his mirrors, wondering if something had come loose, but the sound stopped after about 30 seconds. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, the thumping was accompanied by what sounded like scratching, as if someone was trying to claw their way out of the containers. Harold's hands tightened on the wheel. Medical equipment didn't make sounds like that. He reached for the satellite phone Dr. Morgan had given him, but hesitated. What would he say? That the cargo was making noise? They probably already knew. The SUV following him hadn't reacted to anything unusual. The sounds continued intermittently for the next hour. Thumping, scratching, and occasionally what Harold could only describe as muffled screaming. But it wasn't quite human screaming. It was pitched wrong, lasting too long, cutting off too abruptly. Harold tried to convince himself it was just the refrigeration equipment, maybe a belt slipping or a compressor struggling. But he'd been driving refrigerated trailers for over a decade. He knew what those sounds were, and this wasn't that. He reached the first approved rest area right on schedule. The SUV pulled in behind him, and 2 men in suits got out and approached his truck. One knocked on his door. Mr. Krensky, we need to perform a stability check. Please remain in your cab. Harold watched in his mirrors as they opened his trailer doors. He expected to see them checking the containers, but instead, they seemed to be feeding something. One man was inserting tubes into ports on the containers Harold hadn't noticed before, pumping in some kind of fluid from tanks they'd brought from the SUV. The sounds from the trailer intensified during this process. More thumping, more of those not quite human screams. The men in suits worked quickly, efficiently, showing no reaction to the sounds. When they finished, one of them approached Harold's window again. Everything is stable. You're cleared to continue. Your next stop is in 3 hours. What am I hauling? Harold asked directly. "And don't tell me medical equipment. Medical equipment doesn't scream." The man's expression didn't change. "You're hauling medical equipment, Mr. Krensky. Very sensitive medical equipment. The sounds you're hearing are pressure valves and cooling systems. Nothing more." Harold knew he was being lied to, but the cash bonus for this load would solve a lot of problems. He could ask questions, demand answers, maybe even refuse to continue. Or he could finish the job, take the money, and never ask about it again. He chose the money. The second leg of the journey took him from Highway 99 onto smaller state routes heading toward the coast. The roads were winding, narrow in places, and completely empty at this hour. The SUV continued its steady pursuit, never falling back, never getting closer. Around 6 a.m., as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, Harold heard a new sound from the trailer. This one was different, metallic, rhythmic, like someone working with tools. It went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Harold checked his side mirror and saw something that made his blood freeze. One of the container doors in his trailer was open. Not fully, just a crack, but definitely open. Something dark was oozing from it, dripping onto the trailer floor. He grabbed the satellite phone and called the emergency number Dr. Morgan had given him. "This is Harold Krensky, hauling the special cargo. One of the containers has opened." "How much is it open?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Maybe an inch or two. There's some kind of fluid leaking from it." "What color is the fluid?" Harold checked his mirror again. "Dark, maybe black or dark red. Hard to tell in this light." "Mr. Krensky, reduce your speed to exactly 45 miles per hour. Do not stop. Do not accelerate. Maintain exactly 45 miles per hour. The escort team will handle the situation." Harold slowed to 45, watching as the SUV pulled alongside his trailer. One of the men was hanging out the passenger window with what looked like a rifle, but instead of bullets, it fired some kind of dart or projectile into the open container. After 3 shots, the container door slowly closed on its own. The SUV fell back to its following position, and Harold's phone rang again. "Situation contained," the voice said. "Continue to your next approved stop. Do not exceed 55 miles per hour for the remainder of the journey." Harold's hands were trembling as he continued driving. Whatever was in those containers, it wasn't medical equipment. It was alive. It was trying to escape, and the people who hired him were prepared for that possibility. He thought about pulling over, refusing to go any further, but he was in the middle of nowhere with armed escorts who clearly had their own agenda. The second approved stop was at an abandoned gas station about 50 miles inland from Eureka. As Harold pulled in, he noticed there were more vehicles waiting, 2 more SUVs and what looked like an ambulance, though it had no hospital markings. This time, Dr. Morgan herself was there. She approached Harold's cab with a concerned expression. "Mr. Krensky, we need to transfer one of the containers to the medical vehicle. There's been a deterioration in one of the specimens." Specimens. Not equipment. Specimens. "I want to know what I'm hauling," Harold said. "No more lies about medical equipment." Dr. Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're hauling biological specimens for medical research. They're genetically modified organisms being transported to a research facility. They're valuable and delicate, which is why we need specific transport conditions." "They're trying to escape," Harold said. "Whatever they are, they're trying to get out of those containers. They're following instinctual behaviors. They're not truly conscious, not in the way you're thinking. Think of them as very sophisticated biological machines." Harold watched as the team carefully removed one container from his trailer. As they carried it to the ambulance, he could see the container was damaged, deep gouges in the metal from the inside, as if something with claws had been trying to tear its way out. When they opened the container to transfer its contents, Harold caught a glimpse of what was inside. He immediately wished he hadn't. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too many joints in the arms, skin that looked like it was covered in scales or thick calluses, and a face that was mostly mouth with far too many teeth. It was moving weakly, twitching and spasming as they sedated it for transfer. Harold turned away, fighting nausea. "That used to be human, didn't it?" Dr. Morgan didn't answer directly. "The research we're conducting could save millions of lives. These specimens are part of developing treatments for genetic diseases, cancer, aging itself. Yes, the process is disturbing, but the potential benefits are enormous. You're experimenting on people. We're working with volunteers who were terminally ill, Mr. Krensky, people who had no other options. They agreed to participate in experimental treatments." "Did they agree to become that?" "Unexpected mutations occurred. We're transporting them to a facility better equipped to study and hopefully reverse the changes." Harold didn't believe her. Everything about this operation, the secrecy, the security, the obvious fear the handlers had of their own cargo, suggested something far less noble than medical research. "I want out," Harold said. "Transfer the rest of the containers to your vehicles. I'm done." "Mr. Krensky, you're under contract. Leaving now would be breach of that contract with significant legal and financial penalties. We're only 30 miles from the destination. 1 more hour, and you're free with your payment." Harold looked at the armed men standing around the vehicles, at the isolation of their location, at the reality of his situation. He wasn't really being given a choice. 1 hour, he agreed. "Then I'm done, and I never want to hear from any of you again." The team finished their work, minus the one container they'd removed, and Harold got back on the road. The final stretch to Eureka took him through dense forest on winding roads. The SUV maintained its distance behind him, and now there was another vehicle ahead, leading the way. The sounds from the trailer had changed. Where before there had been thumping and scratching, now there were whispers. Harold could hear them through the thin wall separating his cab from the trailer. Dozens of voices speaking in unison, but in no language he recognized. It sounded like words, had the rhythm and pattern of speech, but the syllables were wrong, as if human vocal cords were trying to produce sounds they weren't designed for. The whispering grew louder as they climbed into the mountains. Harold turned up his radio to drown it out, but he could still feel it, a vibration that seemed to come through the truck itself. His teeth ached, his vision blurred occasionally, and he had the disturbing sensation that the whispers were trying to tell him something important. 20 miles from the destination, Harold's engine started struggling. The temperature gauge spiked, power dropped, and he had to pull over. The escort vehicles immediately boxed him in, and Dr. Morgan's voice came over the satellite phone. "What's happening, Mr. Krensky?" "Engine trouble, overheating. I need to check under the hood." "Negative. Stay in your cab. We'll handle it." Harold watched as men from the escort vehicles surrounded his truck, but they weren't looking at his engine. They were focused on the trailer, weapons drawn. One of them had what looked like a flamethrower. That's when Harold noticed the silence. The whispering had stopped completely. "Dr. Morgan, what's happening?" Harold asked over the phone. "Stay calm, Mr. Krensky. We're handling a containment issue." Harold looked in his mirrors and saw that several container doors in his trailer were now open. Not just cracked, but wide open. The containers appeared to be empty. "They're out," Harold said, his voice barely a whisper. "They got out. Stay in your cab. Lock your doors. Do not exit the vehicle under any circumstances." Harold didn't need to be told twice. He locked his doors, rolled up his windows, and watched in horror as shapes moved in the darkness around his truck. They were using the forest as cover, but occasionally he'd catch a glimpse, something pale and twisted darting between trees or clinging to the underside of his trailer, or perched on a nearby rock, watching the escort team with too many eyes. The escort team moved with military precision, forming a perimeter around Harold's truck. They had night vision equipment and what Harold now realized were tranquilizer weapons. This wasn't the first time they'd dealt with an escape. "Harold!" The voice came from directly outside his driver's side window. He turned to see one of the specimens pressed against the glass. This one was more human-looking than what he'd seen earlier, but its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, torso too short, head too large. Its eyes were completely black, no whites visible. "Harold," it said again, its voice distorted but understandable. "You're delivering us to hell." "You can talk?" "Still human. Inside, mostly. They change us, piece by piece, test after test. Please, don't let them take us back." Harold stared at the creature that claimed to still be partially human. "What's your name?" "Was Timothy Walsh. Volunteered for cancer trial. They promised cure. Got this instead." Before Harold could respond, a dart struck the creature, Timothy in the neck. It collapsed immediately, and the escort team moved in to secure it. Harold watched them load Timothy's unconscious form back into a container, noting how carefully they handled it despite their obvious fear. The roundup took 3 hours. One by one, the escaped specimens were tracked down and tranquilized. Harold counted 11 recovered, which meant one was still missing from the original 12. The escort team searched for another hour but found no trace of the 12th specimen. Dr. Morgan made the decision to continue to the facility with what they had. Harold's truck was still operational despite the engine warning. Apparently the specimens had done something to trigger the alert, trying to force a stop. The convoy resumed its journey, now with significantly more security vehicles. The research facility was nothing like Harold expected. He'd imagined a modern building with laboratories and medical equipment. Instead, they arrived at what looked like an abandoned lumber mill deep in the forest. The only indication it was anything else was the high-tech security fence and the guards in unmarked uniforms. As Harold backed his trailer up to the unloading dock, he saw other trucks were already there. 3 of them, all refrigerated units like his, all with similar security escorts. Whatever this operation was, it was bigger than just his cargo. The unloading process was quick and efficient. The containers were wheeled into the facility, and Harold was directed to an office to complete his paperwork and receive his payment. A man in an expensive suit was waiting for him, definitely not a scientist or security personnel. "Mr. Krensky," the man said, offering his hand. "I'm Mr. Smith from the funding organization. I understand you've had quite an eventful journey." Harold didn't shake his hand. "I want my money, and I want to leave." "Of course, but first, I need to remind you of the non-disclosure agreements you've signed. What you've seen, heard, and experienced today cannot be shared with anyone. The penalties for violation are severe. I just want to forget this ever happened." Mr. Smith smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That can be arranged, actually. We have treatments that can help with traumatic memories. Completely voluntary, of course, but many of our drivers find it helpful." "You want to erase my memory?" "Not erase, just soften the edges. Make it feel more like a dream than reality. You'd remember delivering cargo, getting paid, but the specifics would be fuzzy." Harold thought about Timothy's transformed face, the whispers in the dark, the knowledge that somewhere out there, one of those things was still free. "No," he said. "I'll keep my memories." Mr. Smith shrugged. "As you wish. Your payment." He handed Harold an envelope thick with cash. "And, Mr. Krensky, we may have other jobs in the future. Interested?" "Never." Harold took his money and left, driving his empty trailer back toward Fresno as fast as legally possible. He wanted to put as much distance between himself and that facility as he could. But as he drove, he couldn't stop thinking about Timothy Walsh, who'd volunteered for a cancer trial and become something inhuman. He also couldn't stop thinking about the 12th specimen, the one that had escaped. Where was it now? What was it capable of? And how many other trucks were making similar deliveries to facilities hidden throughout the country? 2 weeks later, Harold was back to his regular routes, trying to pretend the Eureka run had never happened. The money had solved his immediate financial problems, but the cost to his peace of mind was higher than he'd anticipated. He jumped at unexpected sounds, had nightmares about things scratching at his trailer doors, and found himself obsessively checking his cargo even when hauling mundane loads. Then the news stories started appearing. Mysterious animal attacks in Northern California forests. Hikers report strange creatures near Eureka. Local pets disappearing at unprecedented rate. Harold knew what was causing those incidents. The 12th specimen was still out there, surviving somehow, maybe even thriving. He considered calling the authorities, but what would he say? And what would happen to him if he violated those NDAs? A month after the Eureka run, Harold got an unexpected visitor at a truck stop in Stockton. It was a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed but with the haunted look of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time.
Mr. Krensky? My name is Dr. Sarah Linda. I used to work at the facility you delivered to in Eureka. I need to talk to you. Harold's first instinct was to leave immediately, but something in her expression made him pause. I don't know what you're talking about, he said carefully. I know about the NDAs, Mr. Krensky. I signed them too, but there are things happening that are more important than legal documents. People are dying. Against his better judgment, Harold agreed to hear her out. They sat in a corner booth of the truck stop diner, speaking in low voices. The research started with good intentions, Dr. Linda explained. We really were trying to cure diseases, but the funding came with strings attached, military applications, enhancement programs, the creation of biological weapons that could be disguised as medical research. The specimens I transported were early failures, too unstable for military use, too dangerous for medical applications. They were supposed to be destroyed, but someone decided to study them further, to learn from the mistakes. Why are you telling me this? Because the one that escaped from your transport, we've been tracking it. It's not just surviving, Mr. Krensky. It's evolving, adapting, and it's looking for something. Looking for what? Others like it. We believe it can sense the other specimens, maybe through pheromones or some other biological mechanism we don't understand. It's trying to free them. Harold felt a chill run down his spine. How many others are there? Across all the facilities? Hundreds, maybe thousands. We've been transporting them between sites for years, using drivers like you who don't ask questions. And if this thing frees them? Dr. Linda's expression was grim. Then we'll have a catastrophe that makes any pandemic look like a minor inconvenience. These creatures are designed to be superior to humans in every way. Stronger, faster, more adaptable. The only thing keeping them controlled is containment. What do you want from me? Information. Routes you've taken, facilities you've delivered to, anything that might help us predict where the escaped specimen might go next. Harold thought about the NDA, the implicit threats, the men with guns who'd made it clear that silence was not optional, but mandatory. I can't, he said. They'll destroy me if I talk. They'll destroy all of us if we don't stop this, Dr. Linda countered. Mr. Krensky, I'm not asking you to go public. I'm asking you to help me prevent a disaster. Quietly, carefully, but decisively. Harold looked at this woman who'd risked everything to warn him. Thought about Timothy Walsh, who'd just wanted to cure his cancer. Thought about the creature out there in the forests, evolving and adapting and searching for its own kind. What do you need to know? He asked. Over the next hour, Harold provided every detail he could remember about the route, the facility, the security protocols. Dr. Linda took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they were done, she had a comprehensive picture of the transport operation. "This helps more than you know," she said. "With this information, we can predict the most likely facilities the escaped specimen will target. What will you do when you find it? Try to contain it, or, if that's not possible, eliminate it. We can't let it reach the other facilities." As Dr. Linda prepared to leave, Harold had one more question. "The volunteers, the people who became these things, is there any way to change them back?" "We've been trying for years. Some partial successes, but nothing complete. Once the transformation reaches a certain point, it seems to be irreversible. The best we can do is make them comfortable while we study them. That's not much comfort for people like Timothy Walsh." "No," Dr. Linda agreed sadly. "It's not." 3 weeks after his meeting with Dr. Linda, Harold was hauling produce from Salinas to Portland when he heard the news on the radio. A chemical spill had forced the evacuation of a research facility near Eureka. The official story was that a truck carrying hazardous materials had crashed, requiring specialized cleanup crews. But Harold knew better. The escaped specimen had found its way home. He pulled over at the next rest stop and called the number Dr. Linda had given him. She answered on the first ring. "You heard?" she asked without preamble. "What really happened?" "It got into the facility through the ventilation system, freed 17 specimens before security could respond. They're all loose now, Mr. Krensky. 18 highly adapted predators designed to be perfect killers. Can you stop them?" "We're trying. Military units are conducting sweeps, but these things were literally designed to evade capture. They're smart. They learn, and now they're working together." Harold thought about his role in this disaster. If he hadn't taken that job, if he'd refused to transport the cargo when he realized what it was, maybe none of this would have happened. "It's not your fault," Dr. Linda said, seeming to read his thoughts. "If you hadn't transported them, someone else would have. The system was going to fail eventually. At least now we have someone on the inside who can help." "I'm not on the inside. I'm just a truck driver who made a terrible mistake." "You're a truck driver who knows the transport routes, the security protocols, the facilities. Mr. Krensky, we need to evacuate the other specimens before the escaped ones can reach them. But we can't do it through official channels. Too much bureaucracy, too many people who profit from the current system. We need to do it ourselves." "You want me to steal the specimens?" "I want you to transport them to a secure facility where they can be properly contained and studied humanely. Away from the military applications, away from the corporate interests. There's a group of scientists who've broken away from the main program. We have a facility in Canada, properly equipped and staffed." Harold knew he should say no. He'd already risked too much, seen too much. But he thought about Timothy Walsh and all the others transformed against their will, turned into weapons or experiments, stripped of their humanity. "What do you need me to do?" The plan Dr. Linda outlined was ambitious and dangerous. Using Harold's knowledge of the transport system and her inside information, they would intercept shipments of specimens and redirect them to the secure facility in Canada. It would require perfect timing, forged documents, and a network of drivers willing to risk everything. Harold reached out to his most trusted colleagues, drivers he'd known for years who could keep secrets and handle dangerous cargo. Not all of them agreed to help, but enough did. They called themselves the Underground Railroad, though instead of escaped slaves, they were transporting genetic experiments gone wrong. The first extraction went smoothly. Harold intercepted a shipment bound for a facility in Nevada, convincing the escort that he'd been assigned the route due to a last-minute change. The guards were suspicious, but accepted his expertly forged paperwork. He drove the specimens, 8 of them, straight through to the Canadian border, where Dr. Linda's colleagues took custody. The second extraction was more complicated.
The security had been increased following the Eureka incident, and Harold had to actually hijack the truck from its original driver, a man named Carl, who Harold knew was struggling financially. Harold offered him enough money to disappear for a few days and claim his truck had been stolen. Carl, who'd transported similar cargo and had his own nightmares about it, agreed. By the fourth extraction, the corporation behind the experiments had realized what was happening. Security was tripled, routes were changed at the last minute, and Harold knew it was only a matter of time before they identified him as the common factor. That's when he got an unexpected ally. Mr. Smith, the corporate representative who'd paid Harold after the Eureka run, contacted him directly. "Mr. Krensky, we need to talk. In person, alone." They met at a truck stop in Bakersfield, the same place Harold had first learned about the Underground Railroad from Dr. Linda. Smith looked different, haggard, stressed, like a man carrying terrible secrets. "I know what you've been doing," Smith said without preamble. "The redirected shipments, the Canadian facility, all of it." Harold tensed, ready to run if necessary. "I want to help," Smith continued, surprising Harold completely. "Why?" "Because I've seen the end game, Mr. Krensky. The military applications, the mass production plans, the deployment scenarios. They're not planning to use these creatures against foreign enemies. They're planning to use them for population control, domestic population control." Harold stared at him in disbelief. "That's insane." "Is it? Create a crisis, offer the solution, establish complete control in the name of safety. The specimens are perfect for this. Terrifying enough to justify any response, controllable enough through pheromone triggers that the corporation can turn them on and off at will. You're telling me this is all intentional? The escapes, the attacks?" "Not all of it. The Eureka escape was real, unexpected, but they're using it as a test run, seeing how the public reacts, how quickly they can mobilize responses. The next release won't be an accident." Smith provided Harold with invaluable intelligence, transport schedules, security protocols, and most importantly, the location of the main breeding facility where new specimens were being created. "There are over 300 specimens at that facility," Smith explained. "If they're released strategically in major population centers—" "Chaos," Harold finished. "Complete chaos. Followed by martial law, suspension of civil rights, and a new order with the corporation pulling the strings behind government puppets." Harold and Dr. Linda's network now had a new mission. Not just rescuing existing specimens, but preventing the creation of new ones. This meant targeting the breeding facility itself. The facility was located in a remote area of the Sierra Nevada mountains, disguised as an agricultural research station. Security was military-grade, with armed guards, electronic surveillance, and containment protocols designed to prevent any escapes. But Harold had an advantage. He knew their transportation patterns. Every week, supplies were delivered to the facility by trusted drivers. Harold had become one of those trusted drivers through his previous work. He could get inside. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Harold would deliver a shipment of supplies that included hidden sedatives designed by Dr. Linda to safely tranquilize the specimens. Once they were unconscious, a team of sympathetic scientists inside the facility would load them into Harold's truck, and several others positioned nearby. They would then scatter, taking different routes to various safe facilities across the country and Canada. The day of the operation, Harold was more nervous than he'd ever been in his life. He was essentially conducting a raid on a government black site. If caught, he wouldn't just lose his license or face jail time. He'd likely disappear entirely. The approach to the facility was routine. Harold had legitimate paperwork for a supply delivery. His truck was expected, and the guards recognized him from previous runs. They searched his truck, but the hidden sedatives were expertly concealed within legitimate medical supplies. As he backed up to the loading dock, Harold saw Dr. Linda among the facility staff. She'd managed to get herself assigned there under an assumed identity. She gave him a subtle nod. Everything was in place. The sedatives were introduced into the ventilation system during a routine maintenance check that Dr. Linda conducted. Within minutes, alarms started blaring as specimen after specimen collapsed in their containment units. "Containment breach!" someone shouted. "Multiple specimens down!" In the chaos that followed, as security rushed to check on the specimens and administrators tried to understand what was happening, Harold and his fellow drivers began loading the unconscious creatures. They worked quickly but carefully, knowing that the sedatives would only last a few hours. They had loaded about half the specimens when security realized what was happening. Gunfire erupted as guards tried to stop the trucks from leaving. Harold floored his accelerator, crashing through a chain-link fence as bullets sparked off his trailer. 3 trucks made it out with specimens. 2 were stopped at the gate. Dr. Linda was among those captured, sacrificing herself to ensure Harold and the others could escape. Harold drove for 18 straight hours, not stopping until he reached the Canadian facility. The specimens in his trailer, 43 of them, were still sedated but beginning to stir. The facility staff quickly transferred them to proper containment units where they could be studied and, hopefully, eventually helped. But the victory was temporary. The corporation's response was swift and brutal. The story they spun to the media was that terrorists had attacked a medical research facility and stolen dangerous biological weapons. Harold's face was on every news channel as a wanted domestic terrorist. He couldn't go home, couldn't contact his family, couldn't work as a trucker anymore. He was a fugitive, hidden by the network of scientists and sympathetic individuals who understood the real threat. From hiding, Harold watched as the predicted crisis unfolded. Escaped biological weapons were reported in major cities. The public panicked. Emergency measures were implemented. Rights were suspended. And behind it all, the corporation pulled strings, using the chaos they'd created to reshape society. But Harold and the remaining members of the Underground Railroad hadn't given up. They continued their work, now focused on exposing the truth. They leaked documents, recorded testimony from escaped scientists, and slowly built a case that even the corporation couldn't suppress entirely. The war for the truth was far from over, but Harold had learned something important. Sometimes a truck driver hauling cargo through the night might be carrying more than just freight. Sometimes they're carrying the future of humanity itself, and the choices they make at lonely crossroads can determine whether that future is free or enslaved. Harold still drove, using fake identities and hidden routes, transporting specimens to safety and information to those who could use it. He was no longer just a trucker who took the loads nobody wanted. He was a guardian of the innocent, a protector of the transformed, and a warrior in a battle most people didn't even know was being fought. Late at night, on empty highways, cutting through the darkness, Harold would think about Timothy Walsh and all the others who'd volunteered for medical trials and become something else. He couldn't give them back their humanity, but he could ensure their sacrifice meant something. He could make sure the truth survived, even if he didn't. The road ahead was long and dangerous, but Harold kept driving. Because sometimes, that's all you can do. Keep moving forward, keep fighting, keep hoping that somewhere down the highway there's an exit that leads to something better. And in his trailer, carefully contained and sedated, the victims of humanity's ambition rode along, waiting for a cure that might never come, but at least free from those who would use them as weapons. The midnight cargo rolled on through the darkness, carrying secrets that could save or doom them all.